Chapter 2022. The situation in Tianzhou hadn't completely gone out of control yet because everyone was waiting for the result in Jian Province. Before the result in Jian Province, neither the Heavenly Sect nor the Moon Palace would be too aggressive. The situation in Tianzhou hadn't completely gone out of control yet because everyone was waiting for the result in Jian Province. Before the result in Jian Province, neither the Heavenly Sect nor the Moon Palace would be too aggressive. The Heavenly Sect naturally wanted to take down the Sword Sect as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, this idea was destined to be impossible because the Sword Sect's tenacity had severely hindered the Heavenly Sect's attack. After fighting for an entire day and night, both sides could be said to be exhausted. Even so, the Heavenly Sect was unable to break through the Sword Sect's defensive line. The previous talisman arrays had been used up long ago. At this moment, the Sword Sect no longer had the help of talisman arrays. Even so, because of these talisman arrays, the Heavenly Sect had indeed suffered heavy losses. The number of experts from the Heavenly Sect who were injured or even killed by these talisman arrays wasn't small. Because of this, the Heavenly Sect's original advantage had been greatly weakened. After fighting for an entire day and night, let alone taking down the Sword Sect, they hadn't even entered the Jian Province. They were still firmly blocked by the Sword Sect's defensive line. Obviously, the Heavenly Sect didn't want to see such an outcome. The situation in Tianzhou wasn't good to begin with. If they continued to support Tianzhou, compared to the Sword Sect, Tianzhou was their foundation and was more important to the Heavenly Sect. If they couldn't take down the Sword Sect, they could only choose to retreat. However, the elders of the Heavenly Sect were unwilling to accept this. After all, the Heavenly Sect had paid a very high price to attack the Sword Sect. If they didn't gain anything, it would be a big blow to the Heavenly Sect. They weren't willing to let go of the Sword Sect. However, up until now, the Heavenly Sect hadn't gained any advantage at all. On the contrary, they had suffered heavy casualties. Of course, if nothing happened in Tianzhou, the Heavenly Sect wasn't afraid of wasting time with the Sword Sect. After all, the Sword Sect wasn't a match for the Heavenly Sect in terms of overall strength or resources. The Heavenly Sect had more resources to waste on the Sword Sect, but the problem now was that the Heavenly Sect didn't have the time to waste. The situation in the Tianzhou was becoming more and more dangerous. The forces left in the Tianzhou were not enough to stop Moon Palace. As a result, the Tianzhou could not afford to drag this out. Tianzhou could not be given up. This was the basis of Hetian Sect's confidence. But now, the Sword Sect's attack was being blocked by the Sword Sect's tenacious defense. After a day and a night, Hetian Sect was unable to break through the Sword Sect's defense line. The more he fought, the more depressed he felt. At the same time, Sangxing looked at his opponent, the elder from the Heavenly Sect, and sneered, "Is it really okay to continue fighting like this? I don't know if Tianzhou can hold on." The moment Sangxing said this, the elder's face sunk. He looked at Sangxing and scolded coldly, "You're asking for death." This elder really wanted to personally kill Sangxing and everyone from the Sword Sect. However, he knew that in a one-on-one situation, it was extremely difficult to kill an End Realm expert. It was close to impossible. One must know that the life force of an End Realm expert was extremely tenacious. As long as they had a single breath left, they would be able to hang on to their lives. Unless one had absolute strength or several End Realm experts ganged up on one person, only then would there be a chance of killing them. Just like Sangxing and the others. After fighting for a day and night, all of them were heavily injured and had used up a lot of energy. However, their life force was still extremely strong and they didn't look like they were on the verge of death. End Realm experts were indeed hard to kill. Maybe when one reached Junhui's level, one would be able to kill an End Realm expert. Unfortunately, at the same level, it was hard to do so. He wanted to personally kill Sangxing, but unfortunately, that was just wishful thinking. From the start of the battle till now, the Heavenly Sect could be said to be even more anxious than the Sword Sect. They were anxious to take down the Sword Sect and then return to assist Tianzhou. Unfortunately, the Sword Sect didn't give them the chance. Sangxing's attacks became even more ferocious. The elder from the heavenly gate seemed to want to fight to the death with Zhangxing. Zhangxing sneered as he dealt with the elder's attacks. Save it. In a one-on-one situation, you should know that we can't do anything to each other. Zhangxing had never thought about killing this heavenly sect elder in front of him. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but that he couldn't. Therefore, from start to finish, Zhangxing didn't reveal much killing intent. Knowing that he couldn't do it, he still wanted to do it. This wasn't a wise decision. Hearing Zhangxing's words, this heavenly sect elder became more and more anxious, and his attacks became more and more ferocious. However, just as Zhangxing said, no matter how angry this heavenly sect elder was, no matter how much he wanted to kill Zhangxing, he wasn't able to cause any real threat to Zhangxing. The situation had completely fallen into a stalemate. The sword sect had achieved their goal. With the heavenly sect's current consumption, it was clearly impossible for them to break through the sword sect's line of defense. Both sides understood that the result of this battle had already been decided. Neither side could do anything to the other. Regarding this, the people from the sword gate secretly heaved a sigh of relief. As for the heavenly gate, although they were unwilling, seeing that the situation was becoming more and more difficult to obtain victory, in the end, one of the elders of the heavenly gate helplessly said, "Retreat." In the end, they still gave the order to retreat. They had no other choice because there was no point in continuing the battle. The heavenly sect couldn't break through the sword sect's line of defense, and the sword sect was so tenacious. Continuing the battle would only increase the number of casualties in the end. The elders gave the order to retreat. In response, the experts of the heavenly sect slowly began to withdraw from the battle. The sword sect didn't chase after the heavenly sect's retreat. Before the battle, Xiaochen had already given the strict order that if the heavenly sect chose to retreat, the sword sect couldn't chase after them. The heavenly sect wasn't retreating, so there was no point in chasing after them. Seeing the experts of the heavenly sect retreat one by one, the people of the sword sect stood on the spot. They didn't stop them or chase after them. The process of retreating was very smooth, but the elders of the heavenly sect didn't feel happy at all. On the contrary, their faces were dark to the extreme. At this moment, the eyes of the seven end realm experts unknowingly landed on Xiaochen. Looking at Xiaochen, one of the elders said coldly, "Xiaochen, don't be happy too early. The Moon Palace can help you once, but I don't believe that they can help you forever. The sword sect will be destroyed. This is something that no one can change." The attack this time failed in the end, and the sword sect, under the leadership of Xiaochen, successfully blocked the powerful attacks of the heavenly sect. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2023. The experts of the Kadian sect chose to retreat in the end. The sword sect successfully defended against the Kadian sect's attack in the first clash. As a result, the situation was gradually tipping in the favor of the sword sect. The experts of the Kadian sect chose to retreat in the end. The sword sect successfully defended against the Kadian sect's attack in the first clash. As a result, the situation was gradually tipping in the favor of the sword sect. Because the first clash was successful, the Kadian sect clearly had no time to continue fighting with the sword sect. The matter of the Moon Palace in Tianzhou had to be resolved as soon as possible. The Kadian sect could not afford to delay. After treating the injured and cleaning up the battlefield, the others returned to the starship to rest. After doing all this, Xiaochen returned to the starship accompanied by Zhangxing and the others. The victory of this battle did allow Xiaochen to breathe a sigh of relief. However, he could not let his guard down. After all, the Kadian sect had not truly retreated yet. Although Xiaochen guessed that the Kadian sect would definitely not continue fighting with the sword sect after this battle, he could not be sure. If the Kadian sect really did not care and insisted on destroying the sword sect, there was no guarantee. Therefore, before the Kadian sect truly retreated, the sword sect still could not let their guard down. After the battle ended, both sides suffered many casualties. However, compared to the sword sect, the Kadian sect's mood was particularly heavy. At this moment, the seven elders of the Kadian sect gathered together in the starship. They did not care about their injuries. The 7 of them had to make a decision as soon as possible. The Tianzhou side had sent many messages, hoping that the battle here would end as soon as possible so that they could return to the Tianzhou side in time. Unfortunately, the result of the first battle was beyond everyone's expectations. After a fierce battle, the Kadian sect could not even break through the Sword sect's defensive line, let alone destroy the Sword sect. The first battle could be said to have ended in failure. As a result, the Kadian sect was faced with a dilemma. Should he continue to tangle with the Sword sect here, or should he return to Tianzhou and repel the Moon Palace's attack? If they continued to be entangled with the Sword sect, the Tianzhou province would suffer greater and greater losses. If they returned to the Tianzhou province, it would undoubtedly mean that their attack on the Sword sect had ended in failure. The 7 elders present found it difficult to choose between the two choices. Destroying the Sword sect was the unanimous decision of the elders of the Heavenly Sect, but they could not give up on the Tianzhou. After all, it was the foundation of the Heavenly Sect. With a gloomy expression, one of the elders shouted coldly, "Damned Moon Palace, those bitches. If it weren't for them, the Sword sect would have been destroyed long ago." He hated the Moon Palace to the core, and that was indeed the case. Originally, the Heavenly Sect's attack on the Sword sect should have been a sure thing, but because of the Moon Palace's sudden attack, the Heavenly Sect was caught in a dilemma. If it weren't for the Moon Palace, there wouldn't have been so much trouble in the Tianzhou province, and the Sword sect wouldn't have had the ability to block the Heavenly Sect's all-out attack. However, at this point, there was no point in talking about it. Right now, the 7 elders present had to make a choice as soon as possible. Following the elder's angry shout, another person sighed and said, "It's useless to talk about it now. Let's retreat. We can't afford to lose the Tianzhou province." Compared to destroying the Sword sect, the safety of the Tianzhou province was clearly more important to the Heavenly Sect. Now that they couldn't deal a heavy blow to the Sword sect in the first battle, they could only return to the Tianzhou province. As for destroying the Sword sect, that could only be decided in the future. Someone suggested retreating. Hearing this, although the others were unwilling, they didn't object. Everyone knew that this was an unchangeable fact. They could only temporarily give up on attacking the Sword sect and return to the Tianzhou province. The elders fell silent. After a long while, they spoke one after another. "Then let's retreat. We'll make plans after returning to the Tianzhou province." After making their decision, the experts from the Heavenly Gate quickly received the order to retreat. Even though many of them were unwilling to do so, they could only follow the order. The star ships from the Heavenly Sect began to retreat. Xiaochen naturally knew about the Heavenly Sect's actions immediately. Not even 2 hours had passed since the end of the first battle, and the Heavenly Gate had already chosen to retreat. From this, it could be seen how much importance the Heavenly Gate placed on the Tianzhou province. Or perhaps it could be said that the current situation of the Tianzhou province had truly reached a critical juncture. They could not afford any more delays. With the Heavenly Sect retreating, Xiaochen breathed a sigh of relief. Not only Xiaochen, but Song Xing and the others also felt the same. Although the Sword sect seemed to have defended against the Heavenly Sect's attack in this battle, if the two sides continued to be entangled, the Sword sect would definitely be the one to lose. Not only was the Sword sect inferior to the Heavenly Sect in terms of overall strength, but after this battle, the Sword sect's losses were obviously greater than the Heavenly Sect's. Moreover, in order to defend against the Heavenly Sect's attack, Xiaochen had taken out many resources from the Sword sect. Those talisman arrays were made up of countless high-level talismans. The Sword sect probably couldn't afford to use them again. Fortunately, the Heavenly Sect chose to retreat in the end. As a result, the Sword sect's danger was temporarily resolved. With a relieved smile on his face, Xiaochen stood on the deck and looked at the retreating Heavenly Sect starships. He smiled and said to Zhou Song, "Second senior brother, you can send a message to fourth senior sister. Tell them that we're fine here." The news of the Heavenly Sect's retreat naturally had to be reported to the Moon Palace as soon as possible so that they could prepare as soon as possible. Hearing Xiaochen's words, Zhou Song nodded slightly. He then took out a voice transmission talisman and told Xiao Xiao about the heavenly sect's retreat. In the Tianzhou region, the Moon Palace was still slowly advancing. However, at this moment, Xiao Xiao received a message from Zhou Song. He learned that the heavenly sect's people had retreated to the Tianzhou region and asked Xiao Xiao and the others to be careful. Xiao Xiao was overjoyed when she heard this news. She quickly found the Moon Palace's vice palace masters and told them what happened in the Sword Province. Hearing that the heavenly sect's retreat and the Sword Sect's crisis was resolved, the Moon Palace's vice palace masters smiled and nodded. One of them said with a smile, "In that case, it's about time for us to retreat. There's no rush. It'll take at least 5 or 6 days to travel from the Tyrant province to the Tianzhou region. Let's delay it a little longer." Another vice palace master said. Although the heavenly sect had chosen to return to the Tianzhou region, it was impossible for them to arrive immediately. Before that, the Moon Palace had enough time to choose to retreat. Hearing the vice palace master's words, the others didn't have any objections. Then, the Moon Palace's starships began to loot in the Tianzhou region and began to move towards the periphery of the Tianzhou region. They were already prepared to retreat. Please add, please vote, please recommend. Chapter 2024. Xiaochen didn't need to worry about the Tianzhou matter as the Moon Palace could handle it themselves. At this moment, after Xiaochen confirmed that the heavenly sect had indeed retreated, he led his men back to the Sword Sect. This battle was dangerous, but in the end, they had successfully defended against the heavenly sect's attacks and temporarily resolved the danger from them. However, Xiaochen didn't relax too much. The reason was simple. After this matter, the heavenly sect's determination to destroy the Sword Sect was clear. Moreover, Xiaochen was sure that as long as the heavenly sect could catch their breath, they would definitely attack the Sword Sect again. To put it bluntly, the heavenly sect was like a sharp jianyi hanging over the Sword Sect's head. They could destroy the Sword Sect at any moment. To change the situation, it was impossible to rely on external help. They had to become stronger themselves to be able to deal with the threat of the heavenly sect. Although the Moon Palace could help the Sword Sect, just as the heavenly sect elder said, they could help the Sword Sect once, but could they help the Sword Sect forever? No matter what, in the end, they could only rely on themselves. This was something that Xiaochen was clear about. External help was still external. They could be used, but they couldn't be relied on. Once they had the thought of relying on external help, then the Sword Sect wouldn't be far from being destroyed. He had to quickly raise the strength of the Sword Sect. With that, Xiaochen told his thoughts to Cangxing, Zhou Song, and the others. They all agreed with Xiaochen's thoughts. According to Xiaochen's thoughts, there were 2 ways to quickly raise the strength of the Sword Sect. One was to absorb some End Realm experts from the outside to raise the strength of the Sword Sect. However, there were 2 problems with that. First, it wasn't easy to have an End Realm expert. To make an End Realm expert join the Sword Sect wasn't a simple matter. Secondly, who could guarantee the loyalty of the newly joined End Realm experts to the Sword Sect? Perhaps when the Sword Sect was in trouble, these people would leave on their own. Recruiting new End Realm experts into the Sword Sect was a matter of luck and couldn't be forced. This was why Xiaochen didn't have much hope. What Xiaochen really wanted was to think of a way to let those people at Dao Realm completion break through to End Realm to strengthen the Sword Sect. For example, Yang Song and the others were all at Dao Realm completion. If he could help them break through to End Realm, not only would he not need to worry about their loyalty to the Sword Sect, but it would also be much better than recruiting new End Realm experts from the outside. However, to break through to End Realm wasn't a simple matter. First, one needed enough resources and then it depended on one's talent. Apart from that, breaking through to End Realm wasn't something that could be done in a day. It needed a process. During this period of time, Hetian Sect's threat to the Sword Sect still existed and was still huge. Sitting on the main seat, Xiaochen was in deep thought. A moment later, he looked towards Cangxing and said, "In the large world, what secret realms can help people break through to End Realm?" There were many cultivation secret realms in the large world. to let Yang Song and the others have a chance to break through to End Realm, Xiao Chen was thinking of other ways. Facing Xiao Chen's question, Sangxing thought about it for a moment and then said, "There aren't many secret realms that can help martial artists break through to End Realm. Most of them are in the hands of the 10 Ling Tian sects. Secret realms that could help people break through to End Realm were as rare as phoenix feathers and qilin horns. Most of them were in the hands of the 10 Ling Tian sects." Sangxing meant that it would be hard for the Sword sect to borrow these secret realms. In the past, the Sword sect also had a secret realm that could help people break through to End Realm, but it was snatched away by Hetian sect. If Xiao Chen wanted to borrow these secret realms to help Yang Song and the others break through, according to what Sangxing said, there was probably only one place that had a slight chance. The Pill Tomb was a secret realm in the Dan Valley that was of great help to breaking through to End Realm. This was the only place that Xiao Chen had a chance to borrow. The Pill Tomb was a place that the Dan Valley used to throw away the useless pills, which was why it was called the Pill Tomb. It meant that it was the tomb of pills. However, as the number of abandoned pills increased, the Pill Tomb began to change on its own over the years. It became a very unique cultivation mystic realm. The Pill Tomb was indeed useful for breaking through to End Realm, but there were dangers within. Moreover, the Pill Tomb was open to the public. As long as one could pay the price, they could enter to cultivate. Of course, the reason why the Dan Valley opened the Pill Tomb was because of its uniqueness. In the Pill Tomb, one might be able to break through to End Realm, but there was a high chance that one would be corroded by the poisonous gas. It was a mixed bag. Everyone knew that cultivating in the Pill Tomb was dangerous. However, when he heard Sangxing's words, Xiao Chen was a little tempted. He had no choice. The Sword sect didn't have any secret realms that could help people break through to End Realm. A bright light flashed in his eyes. Xiao Chen was in a dilemma and wanted to make a choice. A moment later, Xiao Chen raised his head and looked at Sangxing. "How about this? Senior Sangxing, go talk to Yang Song and the others and see what they think. If they are willing to try to break through to End Realm, the Sword sect will fully support them and let them take cultivation resources. At the same time, you can send people to contact the Dan Valley to think of a way to let them enter the Pill Tomb. However, if they aren't willing, then there is no need to force them." The Sword sect urgently needed End Realm experts to join. Compared to the 10 Ling Tian sects, the Sword sect had too few End Realm experts. Not to mention others, just the Heaven Merging sect had 15 End Realm experts, more than double the number of the Sword sect. With that, if the Sword sect wanted to fight against the Heaven Merging sect, they had to quickly increase the number of End Realm experts. The Pill Tomb was dangerous, so Xiao Chen gave the choice to Yang Song and the others. If they wanted to break through to End Realm, the Sword sect would unconditionally support them. As long as the Sword sect had it, the Sword sect would give them whatever cultivation resources they wanted. When he heard Xiao Chen's words, Sangxing nodded his head. He could understand Xiao Chen's goal. At the same time, seeing Sangxing nod his head, Xiao Chen took a deep breath and said, "Also, I have to make a trip to the Lunar Palace. Although the crisis has been resolved for now, we still have to be on guard against the Heavenly Gate. We have to maintain our relationship with the Lunar Palace. Furthermore, the Lunar Palace has helped us greatly this time. It is only right that I pay them a visit personally. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." Chapter 2025. This time, the Moon Palace's help was indispensable in forcing the Heavenly Sect to retreat. Without the Moon Palace, the Heavenly Sect definitely wouldn't have given up. This time, the Moon Palace's help was indispensable in forcing the Heavenly Sect to retreat. Without the Moon Palace, the Heavenly Sect definitely wouldn't have given up. Moreover, for a long time in the future, the Sword Sect would have to be wary of the Heavenly Sect. Hence, it was necessary to have a good relationship with the Moon Palace. Hearing that Xiao Chen was planning to visit the Moon Palace personally, Sangxing, Zhou Song, and the others didn't object. On one hand, they were preparing to go to the Moon Palace. On the other hand, Xiao Chen told Sangxing to ask Yang Song and the others if they were willing to take the risk and try to break through to the End Realm. They had to increase the strength of the sword sect as soon as possible. With regards to Xiao Chen's 2 orders, Sang Xing and the others went to prepare. As for Xiao Chen, he returned to his cave alone. The battle with the heavenly sect was extremely dangerous. Qin Shuru and the other girls were naturally very worried. They had been waiting for Xiao Chen in the sword sect. In the end, when they saw that Xiao Chen was fine, the girls heaved a sigh of relief. He told the girls about his plans to go to the Moon Palace. Hearing this, although the girls wanted to follow Xiao Chen, they knew that Xiao Chen wasn't going to the Moon Palace to play this time. He was preparing to go to the Moon Palace in these 2 days. Just as the sword sect's crisis was temporarily resolved and Xiao Chen was preparing to head to the Moon Palace, on the other side, within the Dragon Palace, Long Qing had successfully become the disciple of the Dragon Palace old ancestor a few days ago. With the ancestral dragon bloodline, Long Qing was taken to see the ancestor of Dragon Palace as soon as she arrived at Dragon Palace. Then, a few days later, the news that the ancestor of Dragon Palace had accepted Long Qing as his disciple was spread. The ancestral dragon bloodline was extremely rare in the dragon tribe. In the entire Dragon Palace, only the ancestor possessed the ancestral dragon bloodline. Now that Long Qing had appeared, it was natural for the ancestor to accept him as a disciple. Deep in the undersea Dragon Palace, in a huge and deep hall, Long Qing was sitting with a tall and strong old man with snow-white hair. This old man was the ancestor of Dragon Palace. He had officially taken Long Qing as his disciple. At the same time, the ancestor of Dragon Palace also knew that Long Qing's ancestral dragon bloodline was passed on to her by Jun Wuya. Of course, the ancestor of Dragon Palace knew about Jun Wuya. Looking at Long Qing, who still looked worried, the ancestor of Dragon Palace chuckled and said, "Don't worry. The crisis of the sword sect has been temporarily resolved." After the apprenticeship, Long Qing had asked the ancestor of Dragon Palace to help the sword sect. However, at that time, the battle between the sword sect and the heavenly sect had already ended. The heavenly sect had also retreated to Tianzhou. Therefore, Dragon Palace did not take action. Knowing the relationship between Long Qing and the sect master of the sword sect, Xiao Chen, the ancestor of Dragon Palace said this to reassure Long Qing that she did not need to worry and that she could practice peacefully. Hearing this, Long Qing nodded slightly. The crisis of the sword sect had been temporarily resolved. Long Qing naturally heaved a sigh of relief. Long Qing did not need to worry about the situation. As for the sword sect, although the threat of the heavenly sect was still there, after this battle, the sword sect had completely displayed its power. In the Great Thousand World, there was probably no force that dared to underestimate the sword sect. Although everyone knew that the sword sect was able to withstand the attack of the heavenly sect, the strength of the sword sect could not be underestimated. If the sword sect did not have enough strength to withstand the attack of the heavenly sect, then even if the Moon Palace intervened, it would be useless. The rise of the sword sect and the strength of the sword sect put pressure on many forces, especially the Black Emperor sect. After all, the Black Emperor sect was located in the Ba Prefecture and the Jian Prefecture where the Swords Gate was located were neighbors. This time, the Black Emperor sect felt threatened by the Swords Gate after the Swords Gate defeated the Heavenly Gate. Who could guarantee that the Swords Gate would not suddenly attack the Black Emperor sect? In terms of strength, the Sword sect was now above the Black Emperor sect. If the Sword sect attacked the Black Emperor sect, it would be difficult for the Black Emperor sect to deal with. The Black Emperor sect was worried that the Sword sect would suddenly attack, but for the time being, Xiao Chen did not intend to provoke the Black Emperor sect. After staying in the Sword sect for 2 days, Xiao Chen went to the Moon Palace accompanied by Zhou Song and Wu Wan. This time, Xiao Chen went to the Moon Palace personally. On one hand, he wanted to thank the Moon Palace for their help. On the other hand, he wanted to build a good relationship with the Moon Palace so that they could help each other in the future. Looking at the Heavenly Sect, it was obvious that they would not give up so easily. Although they had forced the Heavenly Sect to retreat this time, if the Heavenly Sect attacked again, the Sword Sect would still need to borrow the strength of the Moon Palace. The help of the Moon Palace was indeed very important to the Sword Sect. After all, it was impossible for the sword sect to deal with the heavenly sect by themselves. The group of people rode to the Moon Palace. Xiaochen learned a lot about the Moon Palace from Zhou Song and Wu Huan. It was one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects and was very powerful. However, this was what Xiaochen was most concerned about. According to Zhou Song, the palace master of the Moon Palace, Luo Xing, seemed to have a very complicated relationship with Jun Weiyuan. To put it bluntly, Luo Xing was in love with Jun Weiya. This was most likely the reason why the Moon Palace agreed to help so readily. Xiaochen was Jun Weiya's only disciple. Therefore, Luo Xing chose to help. Otherwise, the Moon Palace would not have helped so readily. Zhou Song was not very clear about the relationship between Luo Xing and Jun Weiya. He only knew that there was definitely a relationship between the two. Xiaochen did not find this strange. However, he could make use of the relationship between Jun Weiya and Luo Xing currently. The Moon Palace was a big tree for the sword sect. Xiaochen's idea was to hug this big tree tightly in exchange for enough time for the sword sect to grow. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for the sword sect to withstand the threat from the heavenly sect alone. The relationship between the palace master of the Moon Palace, Luo Xing, and his master, Jun Weiya, became the best opportunity for the sword sect and the Moon Palace to form an alliance. After traveling from the Sword Province to the Moon Province for a few days, Xiaochen and his group finally arrived at the Moon Palace. Xiao Xiao, who had already received the news, personally came out to welcome them. Seeing Xiaochen and his group, Xiao Xiao went up to Xiaochen with a smile and said, "Little junior brother, not bad. Even the heavenly sect was defeated by you. Senior sister, you must be joking with me. We were able to defeat the heavenly sect this time thanks to the help of the Moon Palace. Otherwise, how could the sword sect have the strength to deal with the heavenly sect?" Xiaochen replied with a smile. This was the first time Xiaochen had come to the Moon Palace. Under Xiao Zhao's lead, Xiaochen and his group naturally entered the Moon Palace without any obstructions. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2026. When Xiaochen arrived at the Moon Palace, he met the palace master, Luo Xing, on the same day. There were only Luo Xing and Xiaochen in the hall. Luo Xing had requested to meet Xiaochen alone. Xiaochen naturally did not refuse. Luo Xing definitely had no ill intentions towards him. Otherwise, she would not have helped the sword sect. Moreover, with Luo Xing's strength, if she really wanted to do anything to him, Zhou Song and Wu Huan would not be able to protect him. As a result, Xiaochen did not hesitate or worry about meeting Luo Xing alone. In the hall, Xiaochen met the palace master of the Moon Palace for the first time. Luo Xing, who was known as Sovereign Luo Xing, was extremely beautiful and wore a purple dress. He took the initiative to cup his hands towards Luo Xing. "Greetings, Sovereign Luo Xing." Xiaochen did not refer to himself as the master of the sword sect. Instead, he referred to himself as a junior. This was clearly to get closer to Luo Xing. Luo Xing smiled faintly as she looked at Xiaochen. "You sly brat. Have a seat." Clearly, Luo Xing had already guessed Xiaochen's thoughts. She could not help but chide him before gesturing for Xiaochen to take a seat. After Xiaochen took his seat, Luo Xing continued. "Actually, you don't have to worry. Since you're Jun Weiya's disciple, I'll naturally help you. You don't have to doubt that." Luo Xing did not waste her breath. She reassured Xiaochen as soon as she spoke. Due to her relationship with Jun Weiya, Luo Xing would definitely not leave him in the lurch. As long as the sword sect was in trouble, Luo Xing and the Moon Palace would definitely lend a hand. Things went much smoother than he had imagined. Luo Xing had given Xiaochen a satisfactory answer without him even having to say anything. Xiaochen naturally would not reject this. He immediately cupped his hands together and thanked the old man. In that case, this junior will thank elder. Things went very smoothly. Or rather, the relationship between Jun Weiya and Luo Xing was closer than Xiaochen had imagined. Therefore, Luo Xing did not ask for anything in return for helping the sword sect. After they finished talking about the sword sect, Luo Xing took the initiative to ask about Jun Wuya, including how Xiaochen met Jun Wuya. In response to Luo Xing's question, Xiaochen did not hide anything. He told Luo Xing about his encounter with Jun Wuya and how he had obtained the heaven-breaking sword master's inheritance. After listening to Xiaochen's explanation, Luo Xing finally sighed and said, "Pa Dian, sigh, what a pity." Luo Xing knew about the heaven-breaking sword master. Furthermore, she was one of the few people who knew about the relationship between the heaven-breaking sword master and Jun Wuya. She knew that Jun Wuya and the heaven-breaking sword master were close friends, but she did not expect that the heaven-breaking sword master, an emperor-level figure, would fall just like that. However, that sword maniac's death did not seem strange. After all, in that freak's eyes, there was only the sword in his hand. Other than that, there was nothing else. From Xiaochen, Luo Xing already knew that the heaven-breaking sword master had fallen and that Jun Wuya was traveling the myriad worlds. Luo Xing did not ask any more questions. While Xiaochen was paying a personal visit to the Moon Palace, on the other side of the heaven-breaking sect, the elders of the heaven-breaking sect had heavy hearts because of the failure of their attack on the sword sect. Originally, it was an excellent opportunity to destroy the sword sect, but it had ended in failure. How could the elders of the heaven-breaking sect accept this? However, under such a heavy atmosphere, all the elders of the heaven-breaking sect had gathered in the main hall on this day. Everyone took their seats one after another. None of them spoke a word, as if they were waiting for someone. There was probably only one person in the entire heaven-breaking sect who could make the experts of the heaven-breaking sect wait so quietly. That person was the sect master of the heaven-breaking sect. That's right, the elders of the heaven-breaking sect were waiting for the sect master of the heaven-breaking sect. Today, the great elder of the heaven-breaking sect had finally received a reply from the sect master. At the same time, the sect master of the heaven-breaking sect had also come out of seclusion. As everyone waited quietly, almost 2 hours later, a middle-aged man in black clothes slowly appeared on the main seat of the hall. The man's figure was thin, and his face was somewhat gloomy. His eyes, in particular, seemed to be filled with a chilling aura. Just a glance at them would make one's hair stand on end. As the middle-aged man appeared, the elders of the heaven-breaking sect all stood up and bowed. "Greetings, sect master." The middle-aged man was the sect master of the heaven-breaking sect, Tao Ming, who was also known as the Wisdom King. Tao Ming had been in seclusion previously and didn't pay attention to the matters of the heaven-breaking sect. This time, he chose to come out of seclusion after receiving a message from the great elder. Tao Ming didn't say a word as he swept his gaze across the elders below. After they took their seats, Tao Ming spoke indifferently. His voice was also extremely cold and chilling. "Speak. What's the matter with the sword sect?" They gathered all the strength of the heaven-breaking sect and still couldn't take down the sword sect. From the tone of his voice, all the elders present could tell that Tao Ming was clearly very dissatisfied with this operation. Immediately, the first elder stood up and said, "Sect master, this time, it was the Moon Palace." He explained the situation to Tao Ming in detail. However, according to the great elder, the failure of this battle was entirely due to the Moon Palace. If it weren't for the Moon Palace, the heaven-breaking sect would have destroyed the sword sect a long time ago. After listening to the great elder's narration, a cold glint flashed across Tao Ming's eyes. He muttered softly, "Luo Xing, it seems like you're really courting death." Tao Ming and Luo Xing were both existences that surpassed the End Realm and stood at the peak of the Great Thousand World. Now that he heard that the Moon Palace had spared no effort to help the sword sect and even attacked the Tianzhou region, Tao Ming felt a trace of anger in his heart. However, as someone who could become an emperor, Tao Ming naturally wouldn't get angry over such a trivial matter. He murmured softly, then looked at the elders below and said, "Don't be so rash. Although the Moon Palace took action this time, you couldn't even deal with a small sword sect. This is enough to show your incompetence." Tao Ming said indifferently. Hearing this, the elders all lowered their heads and said, "Please punish us, sect master." In Tao Ming's opinion, the sword sect was just a declining sect. Although it might have some foundation, it was nothing compared to the heaven-breaking sect, one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. This time, they had gathered all the strength of the heaven-breaking sect, but they still couldn't take down the sword sect. This was indeed caused by the incompetence of the elders present. Tao Ming's expression didn't change as he looked at the elders below and said indifferently, "Forget it. However, this time, let me see how capable the little sect master of the sword sect is. If I want to destroy the sword sect, Luo Xing won't be able to stop me." Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2027. Xiaochen didn't know that Tao Ming had come out of seclusion, but he couldn't deny that along with Tao Ming coming out, Heaven Closing Sect would attack the sword sect once more. This time, with Tao Ming here, the pressure the sword sect faced was much greater than last time. Xiaochen didn't know that Tao Ming had come out of seclusion, but he couldn't deny that along with Tao Ming coming out, Heaven Closing Sect would attack the sword sect once more. This time, with Tao Ming here, the pressure the sword sect faced was much greater than last time. After meeting with Luo Xing at Moon Palace, Xiaochen got the answer he wanted. Even if it was because of Junwuya, Luo Xing did treat Xiaochen well. He also promised that if the sword sect faced danger in the future, Moon Palace would still help. They only stayed in Moon Palace for 3 days before Xiaochen and the others returned to the sword sect. San Xing had already sent a message saying that Yang Song and the others agreed to head to the Pill Tomb to find a chance to break through to the End Realm. This time, Xiaochen wanted to gather all the resources of the sword sect in hopes of developing an End Realm expert that belonged to the sword sect. Yang Song and the others had already reached the peak of the Dao realm, so it wasn't impossible for them to break through. Moreover, with the support of the entire sword sect, they had a high chance of succeeding. The Moon Palace matter was smoothly solved, so what was next was to think of a way to raise the strength of the sword sect. He directly returned to the sword sect. A few days later, in the main hall of the sword sect, Xiaochen personally met Yang Song, Zhao Yu, Qian Ling, and Li Sui. The 4 of them were all at the peak of the Dao realm. This time, facing Xiaochen's decision, the 4 of them agreed without hesitation to enter the Pill Tomb to find a chance to break through to the End Realm. Xiaochen was naturally gratified by this. Inside the hall, Xiaochen looked at the 4 people in front of him and said with a smile, "Seniors, have you really thought this through?" Hearing Xiaochen's words, the 4 of them nodded. Yang Song said firmly, "Sect leader's orders, we don't dare to go against it." The 4 of them were all old members of the sword sect and were once the sword sect heads. Their loyalty to the sword sect was unquestionable. Seeing that the 4 of them had made up their minds, Xiaochen nodded. "Since that is the case, then from today onwards, all the cultivation resources in the treasury of the sword sect can be used by the 4 of you. As for the Pill Tomb, I will quickly confirm it. I hope that you can all break through to the End Realm soon." All the resources in the sword sect were open to the 4 of them. If the 4 of them could break through to the End Realm, then the number of End Realm experts in the sword sect would reach 10. With that, although there was still a gap between them and the Ling Tian sect in Moon Palace, they would be at the top of the 6 top powers. However, it wasn't so simple to break through to the End Realm. Xiaochen could provide cultivation resources, but whether or not they could succeed would depend on Yang Song and the others. Xiaochen was really eager to raise the strength of the sword sect. So, not only for Yang Song and the others, but for the sword sect disciples, Xiaochen had also increased the cultivation resources. To put it bluntly, Xiaochen was using an ocean of resources to raise the strength of the sword sect. In Xiaochen's eyes, the cultivation resources in the treasury were just sitting there. Normally, the sword sect might need to accumulate some cultivation resources, but now, there was no need for that. For the sword sect to rise up, their own strength had to increase. As for cultivation resources, they could think of ways to obtain more. They didn't consider accumulating cultivation resources anymore. Xiaochen even took out all the resources that the sword sect had accumulated over the years to quickly raise the overall strength of the sword sect. After meeting with Yang Song and the others, Xiaochen sent Xian to Dan Valley to discuss the Pill Tomb matter with Dan Valley. To let Yang Song and the others enter the Pill Tomb, they naturally had to pay a price. Xiaochen wasn't stingy about this. As long as Dan Valley didn't ask for too much, they would agree to any conditions. The Pill Tomb was the only cultivation secret realm that Xiaochen could think of that would be helpful for breaking through to the End Realm. For this, Xiaochen was willing to pay a price. Along with Xiaochen's various measures, everyone in the Swords Gate was working hard on their cultivation. From the Vice Sect Masters, the Sword Heads, the Elders, to the ordinary disciples, everyone was working hard on their cultivation, hoping to improve their prowess. Xiaochen naturally saw the hard work of the Sword Sect. At the same time, as Xin Yuanling didn't enter the 100 Spirit Secret Realm, he continued to cultivate. With the Reincarnation Emperor's legacy, Xin Yuanling's cultivation speed was really fast. However, there were many things that couldn't go as he wished. On the third day after he rushed to Dan Valley, news came from Etienne Sect. Sect leader Tao Ming came out and officially declared war on the Sword Sect. Tao Ming was an existence that surpassed the End Realm and was known as the Ming King. Along with this news, the various powers of the Great Thousand Worlds were in an uproar. After all, it had only been half a month since the last large-scale attack on Swords Gate by the Heavenly Sect. But now, the Heavenly Sect was actually going to attack Swords Gate again. Moreover, this time, the Heavenly Sect's leader, Tao Ming, was personally leading the attack. Anyone could see that Etienne Sect was determined to destroy the Sword Sect. Otherwise, why would they attack the Sword Sect again and again? Facing Tao Ming's declaration of war, the Sword Sect temporarily didn't respond. However, in the main hall, Xiaochen, Zhang Xing, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the other members of the Sword Sect were gathered together to discuss Etienne Sect's attack. To be honest, everyone was naturally enraged by the Heavenly Gate. It was like a mad dog, biting tightly onto the Sword Gate and not letting go. It was determined to put the Sword Gate to death. The previous attack had just ended in failure, and it had only been half a month since then, and now, the Kadian Gate was going to attack Swords Gate again. This made Zhang Xing and the others very angry. However, there was nothing they could do. Etienne Sect was too strong. At least, it wasn't something the current Sword Sect could go against. Therefore, facing Etienne Sect's attack, Xiaochen and the others still couldn't do anything. The Kadian Sect was eager to destroy the Sword School. Xiaochen, who was sitting on the main seat, shouted coldly with a gloomy face, "One day, I will destroy the Kadian Sect." He swore in his heart that he would destroy Etienne Sect one day. However, before that, what Xiaochen had to face now was Etienne Sect's attack. This time, Etienne Sect's attack would probably be even fiercer than before. Last time, Etienne Sect could be said to be a group of dragons without a leader because Tao Ming hadn't come out of seclusion. However, this time, the situation was completely different. Tao Ming had come out of seclusion and was personally leading the attack on the Sword Sect. As a result, the pressure that the Sword Sect had to face was obviously much greater than before. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2028. Everyone, including Xiaochen, had a heavy heart as they faced the Heavenly Sect's second attack. This was because this time, they were going to face the Emperor Ming Wang, who had surpassed the End Realm. Everyone, including Xiaochen, had a heavy heart as they faced the Heavenly Sect's second attack. This was because this time, they were going to face the Emperor Ming Wang, who had surpassed the End Realm. It was almost impossible for the current Sword Sect to defeat an Emperor Ming. No one in the Sword Sect could fight against Tao Ming. Sitting on the main seat, Xiaochen looked down at Zhang Xing and the others. A cold light flashed in his eyes as he said calmly, "The Heavenly Sect still hasn't given up. They must destroy the Sword Sect." Hearing Xiaochen's words, Zhang Xing and the others fell silent. Facing Tao Ming, the only thing the Sword Sect could do now was to ask the Moon Palace for help again. Xiaochen had no choice. Just now, Xiaochen had already sent a message to Emperor Luo Xing. From the last conversation, Luo Xing and Jun Wuya seemed to have a close relationship. Xiaochen was also Jun Wuya's only disciple. As such, Luo Xing shouldn't reject the request. This was the Sword Sect's only hope. Otherwise, the sword sect wouldn't be able to stop the heavenly sect with just their strength. Even if Tao Ming didn't make a move, the sword sect wouldn't be able to stop them, not to mention Tao Ming making a move this time. Xiao Chen and the others were waiting for the Moon Palace's reply. Within the Moon Palace, within Luo Xing's cave, Jun Wuya's soul avatar unexpectedly appeared. Sitting opposite Luo Xing and looking at Jun Wuya's soul avatar, Luo Xing said with a bitter face, "Why, are you here to ask for help for your disciple? Ha, you know that I'm not in the Great Thousand World, so I can only come to you." Hearing this, Jun Wuya didn't deny it and said with a smile. Jun Wuya knew that Xiao Chen and the sword sect wouldn't be able to stop Tao Ming personally. Therefore, he could only ask the Moon Palace for help. Luo Xing was the only person who could make Jun Wuya feel 100% assured. Seeing Jun Wuya admit it so straightforwardly, Luo Xing rolled his eyes and said, "You know Tao Ming's strength. Do you want the Moon Palace and the Heavenly Sect to start a full-scale war?" Luo Xing, Luo Xing, Luo Xing, Jun Wuya Luo. He didn't want the Moon Palace and the Heavenly Sect to start a full-scale war. He only wanted the Moon Palace to help the Sword Sect block the attack of the Heavenly Sect. Jun Wuya would deal with the rest after he returned to the Great Thousand World. Hearing Jun Wuya's words, Luo Xing didn't refuse. Since Jun Wuya had personally appeared, Luo Xing had no reason to refuse. However, although she agreed to Jun Wuya's request, Luo Xing still said with some dissatisfaction, "Back then, you left without saying a word. When do you plan to come back this time?" Luo Xing didn't hesitate too much about supporting the sword sect. In front of Jun Wuya, Luo Xing was more like a resentful wife. Not many people in the Great Thousand World knew about the relationship between Jun Wuya and Luo Xing. However, both of them seemed to be lovers in the past. However, Jun Wuya left without saying goodbye, which left Luo Xing feeling resentful. Upon hearing Luo Xing's words, Jun Wuya said with a bitter smile, "You know that I don't like to be restrained by others. Besides, back then, that old man Pot Ian, speaking of that incident, Jun Wuya felt rather helpless. With Jun Wuya's personality, he loved to travel the world and naturally wouldn't stay in one place for too long." Upon seeing Jun Wuya's bitter smile, Luo Xing said angrily, "So are you going to leave again this time?" "I don't know," Jun Wuya Luo Xing replied truthfully. Upon hearing Jun Wuya's words, Luo Xing pondered for a few moments and said, "Forget it. But I've helped you so much this time, so you can't hide from me anymore." "Okay." With Jun Wuya's personal appearance, Luo Xing naturally couldn't watch the sword sect emerge. Then, the two of them chatted for a while before Jun Wuya's soul clone gradually dissipated. After Jun Wuya disappeared completely, Luo Xing moved and appeared in the main hall of the Moon Palace. Shortly after, a group of Vice Palace Masters of the Moon Palace appeared in the main hall. There were a total of 16 of them and all of them were in the End Realm. The Moon Palace was indeed stronger than the Heavenly Gate, and this could be seen from the number of End Realm powerhouses in the Moon Palace. Looking at the higher-ups of the Moon Palace gathered in the main hall, Luo Xing sat on the main seat and said calmly, "Get ready to head to the Sword Sect." This time, the Heavenly Gate made a move. Luo Xing knew that with Tao Ming's personality, using Tianzhou to restrict the Heavenly Gate like last time wouldn't work. With Tao Ming's personality, it was impossible for him to stop. Hence, this time, Luo Xing directly led the experts of the Moon Palace to the Sword Sect and fight with the Heavenly Gate head-on to resolve the crisis of the Sword Sect. Hearing Luo Xing's words, the higher-ups of the Moon Palace were stunned. Were they really going to fight with the Heavenly Gate for a Sword Sect? Many people felt that it wasn't worth it. After all, this was a matter of the Sword Sect and not the Moon Palace. However, since Luo Xing had spoken, no one dared to object. The Moon Palace decided to fully support the Sword Sect. Far away in the Great Thousand World, in an extremely ordinary small city, an old man in coarse hemp clothes was walking slowly on the streets of the city. The old man had a benevolent face. Although he looked extraordinary, he didn't reveal any aura from his body. Having traveled to countless worlds, Jun Wuya strolled in the small city that didn't seem special at all. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, and a faint smile hung on his face. He muttered softly, "It's about time to go back." The old man was Xiao Chen's master, Junwia. He already had thoughts of returning to the Great Thousand World, but the people of the Great Thousand World didn't know about it yet. Just as the Moon Palace was making a move and Junwia was preparing to return to the Great Thousand World, on the other side, in one of the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, Mu Tian Mountain. At that moment, in a cave dwelling deep in Mu Tian Mountain, Tao Ming and a young man were sitting opposite each other. To be able to sit as equals with Tao Ming, there was no doubt that the young man was an emperor. The young man's name was Yun Chen, and he was the sect leader of Mu Tian Mountain. People called him Supreme Yun. At that moment, the two of them looked at each other, and Tao Ming spoke first. "I want to destroy the Sword Sect." "Then why didn't you go to the Sword Province? Why did you come to my place?" Yun Chen asked with a smile when he heard Tao Ming's words. Tao Ming wanted to destroy the Sword Sect. This was something that everyone in the Great Thousand World knew. When he heard Yun Chen's words, Tao Ming's expression remained indifferent. "Because I need your help. Luo Xing will definitely take action. I need you to hold her back. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." Chapter 2029. The last time the Heavenly Sect attacked the Sword Sect, it was because of the Moon Palace that they failed. Therefore, this time, Tao Ming personally led the Heavenly Sect to destroy the Sword Sect, so he definitely had to be wary of the Moon Palace. The last time the Heavenly Sect attacked the Sword Sect, it was because of the Moon Palace that they failed. Therefore, this time, Tao Ming personally led the Heavenly Sect to destroy the Sword Sect, so he definitely had to be wary of the Moon Palace. However, the Heavenly Sect alone was obviously not enough to deal with the Moon Palace and the Sword Sect at the same time, so Tao Ming looked for Yun Chen. In the 10 Great Ling Tian sects, Tao Ming and Yun Chen had a very close relationship. Moreover, no one knew that when the two of them were young, they were once fellow disciples. However, that was a very long time ago. It was so long ago that the sect they were in had long disappeared from the Great Thousand World. However, because they were once fellow disciples when they were young, their relationship was very close. Tao Ming also believed that as long as he asked, Yun Chen would definitely not reject him. As expected, after hearing Tao Ming's words, Yun Chen was silent for a moment before he nodded and agreed. "All right, but Mu Tianshan will not go all out. I will at most let 5 End Realm Masters attack, including me." Helping was one thing, but Yun Chen obviously would not use all of Mu Tianshan's strength. After all, destroying the Sword Sect was the Heavenly Sect's matter and had nothing to do with Mu Tianshan. When he heard Yun Chen's words, Tao Ming had clearly already expected this. Without any hesitation, he nodded and agreed. All right. He had never expected Yun Chen to go all out. Tao Ming's goal was only to hope that Yun Chen would attack and restrain Luo Xing. That would be enough. With Yun Chen's help, Tao Ming was filled with hope of destroying the Sword Sect. As long as Yun Chen could restrain Luo Xing, then it would not be an exaggeration to say that even if Tao Ming attacked alone, it would be enough to destroy the Sword Sect. After all, there were no Emperor Realm Masters in the Sword Sect. In other words, no one in the Sword Sect could stop Tao Ming. The only person who posed a threat to Tao Ming was Luo Xing. However, Luo Xing was being held back by Yun Chen. Hence, he was naturally no longer a threat. They did not know that Tao Ming had come to Mu Tian Mountain. Within the Sword Sect, Xiao Chen personally appeared to welcome Luo Xing and the others from the Moon Palace. This time, in order to help the Sword Sect, Moon Palace sent out all of its experts. Luo Xing wasn't the only one who came. Aside from him, the 16 Vice Palace Masters of Moon Palace also came. As for the Tao Realm and Enlightenment Realm experts, there were thousands of them. With so many experts rushing to the Sword Sect, it was clear that the Lunar Palace had made their stance clear. They would protect the Sword Sect no matter what. Of course, Luo Xing's actions were probably related to Junwia's appearance. Luo Xing personally arranged accommodations for the Moon Palace members while Xiao Chen and Luo Xing went to the main hall of the Sword Sect. this wasn't the first time Luo Xing came to the Sword Sect. When the heaven-breaking Sword Supreme was still alive and the Sword Sect was at its peak, Luo Xing had already been here. Now that he was here again, Luo Xing lamented. The Sword Sect used to be more powerful than the Moon Palace, but now... Sigh. When the Sword Sect was at its peak, the Sword Sect was ranked second among the 10 great Ling Tian sects. One could imagine how powerful the Sword Sect was back then. Even among the 10 great Ling Tian sects, the Sword Sect was undoubtedly the overlord. However, the former overlord had declined. Although the Sword Sect had indeed shown signs of rising under Xiao Chen's leadership, it was still far from what it used to be. If it were the Sword Sect from back then, not to mention attacking, the Heavenly Sect wouldn't even dare to provoke them. Upon hearing Luo Xing's words, Xiao Chen chuckled. Who can guarantee that the Sword Sect will never decline? But I believe that the Sword Sect will definitely rise again. Ha, that's right. With your master around, it's hard for the Sword Sect not to rise again, Luo Xing replied with a smile. Luo Xing didn't know if Xiao Chen could lead the Sword Sect to rise again, but with Zheng Wuya around, it shouldn't be difficult for him to bring the Sword Sect back to the 10 great Ling Tian sects. After all, the title of the #1 powerhouse in the Great Thousand World wasn't just for show. Since they had decided to fully support the Sword Sect, Xiao Chen naturally held a banquet that night for the powerhouses of the Sword Sect in the Moon Palace to have a good drink. The fact that almost all the powerhouses of the Moon Palace had supported the Sword Sect naturally couldn't escape the Heavenly Sect's eyes. A few days later, in the main hall of the Heavenly Sect, Tao Ming had returned from Mount Mu. Upon hearing that Luo Xing had led almost all the powerhouses of the Moon Palace to support the Sword Sect, a cold glint flashed in Tao Ming's eyes as he sneered. Luo Xing, it seems like you really want to protect the Sword Sect. However, can you really do that? If it was before, with the full support of the Moon Palace, Tao Ming wouldn't have had the confidence to face both the Moon Palace and the Sword Sect at the same time. However, now that Yunchen had agreed to help, as long as he restrained Luo Xing, the Sword Sect was no longer a concern. He was still full of confidence and wasn't worried at all because of the Moon Palace's support. Very quickly, on the morning of the second day, the powerhouses of the Heavenly Sect, under Tao Ming's lead, once again headed toward the Sword Province. This was the second time the Kadian sect had launched an attack on the Sword's Gate. With the Kadian sect's actions, the major forces in the Great Thousand World naturally paid close attention to it. After all, Tao Ming was the one leading the attack this time. No one knew if the Sword's Gate could survive. When the Heavenly Sect attacked again, Xiao Chen and Luo Xing immediately received the news. Luo Xing didn't have anything to worry about. It wasn't like she hadn't fought with Tao Ming before. In general, their strength should be about the same, and Luo Xing might even be slightly stronger than Tao Ming. However, there was a limit to how strong they could be. However, Luo Xing wasn't worried about dealing with Tao Ming. In addition, the powerhouses of the Moon Palace were all mobilized this time. In Luo Xing's opinion, it wouldn't be difficult to stop the Heavenly Sect. Luo Xing wasn't worried at all. She just waited for Tao Ming and the powerhouses of the Heavenly Sect to arrive. However, Xiao Chen didn't think so. In Xiao Chen's opinion, since Tao Ming already knew that the Moon Palace was fully supporting the Sword Sect, why would he still launch a large-scale attack? Did Tao Ming think that the Heavenly Sect could defeat both the Moon Palace and the Sword Sect at the same time? Could they successfully destroy the Sword Sect under the protection of the Moon Palace? This was obviously impossible. After all, everyone knew that the Moon Palace was indeed stronger than the Heavenly Sect in terms of strength. However, even so, Tao Ming still launched an attack on the Sword Sect. This was very strange in itself. Moreover, Tao Ming was obviously not a fool. This could only mean that Tao Ming definitely had a backup plan. However, as for what this backup plan was, Xiao Chen didn't know. He had a strange feeling in his heart that things weren't so simple. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2030. In the end, the only thing Xiao Chen could think of was that Tao Ming had also found external help. In the end, the only thing Xiao Chen could think of was that Tao Ming had also found external help. Since the Sword Sect could borrow the power of the Moon Palace to deal with the Heavenly Sect's attack, why couldn't the Heavenly Sect borrow the power of others to restrain the Moon Palace? This was the only way to explain why Tao Ming did not have the slightest intention of retreating, even though he knew that the Moon Palace had already fully supported the Sword Sect. Tao Ming had also borrowed the power of the outside world, but Xiao Chen could not guess where this power came from for the time being. However, since Tao Ming was the sect master of the Heavenly Sect, he naturally had his own connections in the Great Thousand World. There was no doubt about this. With this guess in mind, Xiao Chen directly called Yang Song and asked him to make a trip to the Dan Valley as soon as possible. No one knew why Xiao Chen asked Yang Song to go to the Dan Valley. Even Xiao Chen himself was not sure if Yang Song would be able to gain anything by going to the Dan Valley. However, there was no harm in giving it a try. Yang Song secretly left the Sword Sect and rushed to the Dan Valley. At the same time, the Heavenly Sect rushed directly to the Sword Province, and the route was the same as before. They would first go to the Bazhou and then attack the Sword Province from there. They still chose to attack head-on. From this, it could be seen that Tao Ming was really confident and did not take the Sword Sect or the Moon Palace seriously at all. From Tao Ming's performance, it was as if he did not care about the Moon Palace at all. It seemed that even with the Moon Palace around, they would not be able to protect the Sword Sect. Faced with Tao Ming's confidence, Xiao Chen was even more certain of his guess. Tao Ming was not stupid. He must have prepared a backup plan. Xiao Chen's guess could be said to be completely correct. Tao Ming had indeed left a backup plan. Time slowly passed. 5 days later, many experts of the Heavenly Union sect had successfully rushed to the Bazhou. Just like before, the Black Emperor sect did not dare to have the slightest objection to the actions of the Heavenly Union sect. Not only did the Black Emperor sect not stop the experts from the Heavenly Fusion sect from entering the Taira Prefecture, they even opened their doors wide for them. At the same time, at the border between the Taira Prefecture and the Sword Prefecture, the Sword sect once again set up a defensive line. This time, the experts from the Moon Palace joined in as well. Perhaps it was because of the presence of so many masters from Moon Palace, as well as the presence of an Emperor Realm master like Luo Xing, but this time, everyone in the Sword sect seemed to be in a much more relaxed mood. Xiao Chen felt a little helpless when he saw that everyone was clearly in a more relaxed mood. However, there were some things that he couldn't say out loud. Otherwise, it would be a blow to the morale of his side. The others didn't know, but Xiao Chen was more and more certain that Tao Ming must have left a backup plan, and this backup plan was probably enough to deal with the Moon Palace. Even if it couldn't, it would definitely be able to restrain the Moon Palace. With the Moon Palace's experts present, the Heavenly Union sect was nothing to be afraid of. This was the thought of everyone in the Sword sect. While the Sword sect and Moon Palace's experts were preparing for battle, on the other side of the Bazhou, the Heavenly Union sect's experts had also finished gathering. This time, it was different from the previous time. The Heavenly Union sect had gathered almost all of their forces and was preparing to attack the Sword sect. Therefore, the number of people from the Heavenly Union sect this time was clearly much greater than the previous time. All 15 elders were present, and there was also an Emperor Realm Master, Tao Ming. The night was dark and there was no moon. The sky was filled with dark clouds, as if they were preparing for the upcoming battle, giving off an extremely oppressive feeling. The Sword sect, the Moon Palace, and the Heavenly Union sect were facing each other from a distance. Looking from the dark night, the three sects' camps were like two giant beasts crawling on the ground, ready to fight at any time. The night passed very slowly, at least for Xiao Chen. All this time, Xiao Chen wasn't as confident or optimistic as the others, because Xiao Chen guessed that Tao Ming must have left a backup plan. The night passed slowly while Xiao Chen was deep in thought. This night wasn't easy for Xiao Chen. At the same time, Xiao Chen's killing intent towards the Heavenly Union sect grew stronger and stronger. The Heavenly Union sect was like a vicious dog. Now that they had bitten the Sword sect, they simply wouldn't let go no matter what. Thinking about it, ever since the Heavenly Union sect attacked the Sword sect, from the initial encirclement to the current 2 large-scale attacks, all of which made the Sword Sect exhausted. One day, when the Sword Sect really had the strength to challenge the 10 great Ling Tian sects, Xiao Qian would definitely not hesitate. His first target would definitely be the Heavenly Union sect. Thinking of this, the sky gradually brightened up. At the same time, Zhang Xing quickly came to Xiao Qian's room and said with a solemn expression, "Sect leader, the Heavenly Union sect is here." The Heavenly Union sect was finally going to launch an attack. Hearing this, Xiao Qian nodded slightly. Then, he rose into the air with Zhang Xing and flew towards the front line. It wasn't just Xiao Qian and Zhang Xing. Along with the Heavenly Union sect's actions, experts from the Sword Sect and Moon Palace's camps flew across the sky. Soon, they arrived. Tens of thousands of figures stood in the air and looked at the Heavenly Union sect's experts who were constantly approaching from afar. The Sword Sect and Moon Palace's experts were ready for battle. Xiao Qian and Luo Xing stood at the front of the group. Behind them were Zhang Xing and the other End Realm experts of the Sword Sect and Moon Palace. Looking at each other from afar, not long after, the Heavenly Union sect's experts appeared in front of everyone under Tao Ming's lead. This was the first time they saw Tao Ming. However, Tao Ming didn't care about Xiao Qian. From the start, Tao Ming's gaze landed on Luo Xing. Tao Ming's eyes flickered with a faint frost python. He looked at Luo Xing and sneered as he said, "Sovereign Luo Xing, is a mere sword gate worth doing this for? You actually let all the experts of the Moon Palace to reinforce us. Is this brat your illegitimate son?" As he said that, Tao Ming's face revealed a mocking expression. Hearing this, Luo Xing's face sank. "Emperor Ming Wang, we haven't seen each other for so many years. It seems like your mouth is still so stinky." "Ah, cut the crap. Luo Xing, I'll give you a chance. Take the people of the Moon Palace and leave. Don't interfere in the matters of the Sword Sect." Tao Ming didn't care at all. Facing Luo Xing, Tao Ming didn't fear him at all. Hearing this, Xiao Qian frowned. At the same time, Luo Xing naturally didn't hesitate to reject. "If you want to fight, then fight. Cut the crap." It was obviously impossible to take the people of the Moon Palace and leave. Tao Ming wasn't surprised when he heard Luo Xing's words. This was something he had guessed long ago. However, at this moment, the smile on Tao Ming's face grew wider. He looked at the empty sky beside him and smiled. "Brother Yunchen, why aren't you showing yourself?" Following Tao Ming's words, a space crack appeared in the sky. Then, a young man walked out slowly. This young man was none other than the sect leader of Mutian Mountain, Supreme Cloud, Yunchen. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2031. Yunchen's appearance had indeed exceeded everyone's expectations. Even Luo Xing's expression had turned grave at this moment. Yunchen's appearance had indeed exceeded everyone's expectations. Even Luo Xing's expression had turned grave at this moment. When Xiao Qian saw Yunchen, his expression also darkened. However, he thought to himself helplessly that Tao Ming indeed had a backup plan. Xiao Qian already knew Yunchen's identity from Zhang Xing. He was the sect master of Mount Mutian, also known as Supreme Yun. He was in existence on the same level as Luo Xing and Tao Ming. He was a true emperor-level figure. He didn't know how Tao Ming managed to get Yunchen to attack. He also didn't know that Tao Ming and Yunchen were fellow disciples when they were young. However, no matter what, Yunchen's appearance did increase the pressure on the Moon Palace and Sword Sect. If it was only Tao Ming, Luo Xing wouldn't be afraid at all. However, now that Yunchen had appeared, the situation was completely different. Luo Xing definitely didn't have a chance of winning if he wanted to fight 2 people by himself. Moreover, after Yunchen appeared, another 5 End Realm experts from Mount Mutian slowly walked out from behind him. As a result, the hearts of the people from the Moon Palace and Sword Sect became even heavier. A mocking smile appeared on Tao Ming's face as he looked at Luo Xing and said, "How about it, Supreme Luo Xing? If you retreat now, I still won't attack you. How about that?" Tao Ming's face was filled with a confident smile as if he already had victory in his grasp. Luo Xing's expression was serious. He didn't reply. Instead, he transmitted a message to Xiaochen. "Little fellow, I'll hold them back. Take your people and run. Where there's life, there's hope." Facing two Supreme Realm experts at the same time, no matter how strong Luo Xing was, he wasn't confident that he could protect the Sword Sect. Therefore, Luo Xing immediately asked Xiaochen to lead the Sword Sect members and run. The Sword Sect would definitely not be able to win this battle. Everything else aside, as long as either Yun Chen or Tao Ming were free, the Sword Sect would not be able to stop them. Moreover, Luo Xing also had some understanding of Yun Chen and Tao Ming's strength. While he could delay the two of them for a period of time, it was definitely impossible for him to hold them back for long. Therefore, Luo Xing immediately asked Xiaochen to lead the others and flee. As for the Sword Sect, it was obvious that they could only give up on it. They had to protect their people first. As for the other matters, they would deal with them later. Hearing Luo Xing's words, before Xiaochen could reply, Tao Ming, who was in front of him, had already spoken first. "There is no need to be stubborn. The Sword Gate will be destroyed today. Luo Xing, since you are not willing to retreat, then don't blame me." Tao Ming did not know what Luo Xing and Xiaochen were planning. However, the current situation had completely tilted towards the Heavenly Gate. As such, Tao Ming naturally did not waste any time. After his words sounded, he immediately attacked Luo Xing. Following Tao Ming's attack, Yun Chen naturally did not stay idle. He followed closely behind and chose to attack. Facing the attacks of two Emperor-level figures, Luo Xing's face darkened. However, he did not give up. A terrifying aura also rose from his body and soared into the sky. He took a step forward and his figure instantly disappeared from his original spot. Then, the three of them met. Luo Xing directly locked down the space, using his own strength to hold back Tao Ming and Yun Chen. The three of them fought fiercely. The space where the three of them fought was also completely locked down. The people outside could not even get close to it. Although the space was locked down, the power of the battle between Emperor-level figures still caused everyone present to involuntarily tremble in fear. Compared to the End Realm Almighties, the battle between Luo Xing and the other two was simply too terrifying. They originally thought that the End Realm Almighties were already considered the top experts in the Great Thousand World. However, when compared to Emperor-level figures, the difference between the two could be described as the difference between heaven and earth. Needless to say, even an Emperor Realm Master's casual attack would be infused with the power of principles. Even a casual palm strike would be surrounded by the power of principles. At the Emperor level, the power of laws could be said to be at their fingertips. A simple punch or palm seemed to have the power to destroy the heavens and earth. It was also because Luo Xing and the other two had locked down the space. Otherwise, the battle between the three of them would probably destroy everything present. The surrounding people would probably be affected as well. It was simply incomparable to the End Realm Almighties. The battle between Emperor-level figures was truly destructive. The three Emperor-level figures had already exchanged blows. Very quickly, the people from Etienne sect also attacked the Sword Sect. At the same time, the five End Realm Almighties from Mutian Mountain also attacked at the same time. Luo Xing was already held back by Tao Ming and Yun Chen. Facing the attack of Etienne sect in Mutian Mountain, the experts of Moon Palace naturally would not allow themselves to be captured without putting up a fight. They immediately faced the enemy. At the same time, because Xiaochen did not give the order to retreat, Sang Xing and the others also matured. In an instant, everyone was engaged in a great battle. They did not listen to Luo Xing's order and chose to retreat. Xiaochen was very clear that even if they retreated, where could they retreat to? Moreover, there were so many people in the Sword Sect. How could they escape Tao Ming's pursuit? Competing in speed with an Emperor-level figure was simply seeking death. Hence, Xiaochen was very clear that even if they tried to escape, they would not be able to. Xiaochen took a deep look at Luo Xing, who was fighting Tao Ming and Yun Chen all by himself. Although Luo Xing was exchanging blows with the two of them, Xiao Chen knew very well that this situation wouldn't last for long. There was no good way. In the face of an emperor-level figure, this was no longer something that could be dealt with by schemes. In the face of absolute strength, all plans were just fleeting clouds. Now, Xiao Chen's only hope was Yang Song, who had gone to the Dan Valley. He hoped that Yang Song would be able to complete the task that he had asked of him. In that case, there might be a chance for things to turn around. In the face of an emperor-level powerful strength, everything seemed so powerless. Just as Xiao Chen was thinking this, Tao Ming, who was fighting fiercely with Luo Xing, suddenly retreated. Seeing this, Luo Xing wanted to chase after Tao Ming, but unfortunately, he was stopped by Yun Chen. Yun Chen blocked Luo Xing's path and smiled faintly. "Emperor Luo Xing, is it worth it to risk your life for a sword sect? If you ask me, why don't you give up? Anyway, the sword sect and your moon palace are not related in any way. Is there a need to risk your life like this?" Yun Chen said faintly. At the same time, Tao Ming also smiled and said, "Brother Yun, I'll leave it to you." After saying this, his figure moved and he charged towards Xiao Chen. Tao Ming did not have any intention to kill Luo Xing. First of all, Luo Xing's strength was obvious. It would be very difficult to kill him. Moreover, Tao Ming did not intend to start a full-scale war with the Moon Palace for the time being. Therefore, it would be enough as long as he could hold Luo Xing back. Please add me to your collection, monthly votes, recommend me. Chapter 2032. Tao Ming had no interest in killing Luo Xing. Firstly, it was impossible. Secondly, there was no need to do so. Thirdly, if he really killed Luo Xing, it would inevitably lead to a full-scale counterattack from Moon Palace. This was not something Tao Ming wanted to see. Tao Ming's only goal in this battle was to destroy the sword sect. Therefore, after Yun Chen stalled Luo Xing, Tao Ming directly charged towards Xiao Chen. To shoot a man, shoot the horse first. To capture the bandits, capture the leader first. As the sect master of the sword sect, Xiao Chen naturally became Tao Ming's primary target. Luo Xing was furious as he watched Tao Ming charge towards Xiao Chen. On one hand, he was angry that Yun Chen had actually helped the heavenly sect. On the other hand, he was angry that Xiao Chen had not listened to him and retreated immediately. However, even though he was angry, it was too late to say anything now. With Yun Chen blocking him, Luo Xing could only watch as Tao Ming charged towards Xiao Chen, but there was nothing he could do. It was impossible for him to break free from Yun Chen's entanglement. Sensing Luo Xing's anxiety, Yun Chen smiled faintly and said, "Luo Xing, let me tell you to give up. There's no point in us continuing to fight. As long as you don't care about the sword sect, I won't do anything either. How about it?" Yun Chen only needed to stall Luo Xing. As for anything else, he was not willing to pay attention to it. However, Luo Xing had no intention of replying to his words. Instead, his attacks became even more ferocious. Because of Jun Wuya, Luo Xing naturally did not want to see Xiao Chen die. However, Luo Xing was helpless in the face of the current situation. Watching Tao Ming appear in front of Xiao Chen, Luo Xing felt a sense of helplessness in his heart. In a flash, Tao Ming appeared in front of Xiao Chen. Facing an Emperor Realm expert who wanted to kill him, one could imagine the pressure Xiao Chen was under. Although Tao Ming did not reveal any terrifying aura or pressure, Xiao Chen's back was already soaked in sweat. On the other hand, Tao Ming smiled at Xiao Chen and calmly said, "Xiao Chen, right? You really shouldn't be the sect master of the sword sect." Facing Xiao Chen, Tao Ming spoke as if he was talking about a trivial matter. At the same time, Tao Ming did not have any grudges against Xiao Chen. He only killed him because he was the sect master of the sword sect. After hearing Tao Ming's words, Xiao Chen did not answer because it was meaningless to say anything now. In front of Tao Ming, Xiao Chen knew that he had no power to fight back, so he was too lazy to say anything. At this time, the only thing Xiao Chen was still thinking about was Yang Song. He hoped that Yang Song could complete the task he gave him and arrive in time. Seeing Xiao Chen remain silent, the smile on Tao Ming's face grew wider. Then, as if talking to himself, he said, "Since there's nothing to say, let's be on our way." Xiaochen chose to remain silent. Tao Ming did not care about this. After all, in his opinion, after today, Xiaochen would no longer exist in this world. As soon as he finished speaking, Tao Ming immediately prepared to attack. However, at this moment, a spatial crack suddenly appeared in front of Xiaochen. The sudden appearance of the spatial crack made Tao Ming frown slightly. But soon, an old man in gray clothes walked out of the spatial crack. He had an ordinary appearance, but he had a sage-like demeanor. Seeing this old man, Xiaochen was delighted, but Tao Ming frowned slightly. A strange look flashed in his eyes. Pill Venerable, Dan Qingyang, the old man was the valley master of the Dan Valley, Dan Qingyang, who was also an Emperor realm expert. Tao Ming did not expect Dan Qingyang to suddenly appear here. Regarding this, he was somewhat puzzled and angry. Facing the frowning Tao Ming, Dan Qingyang said calmly, "Emperor Ming Wang, long time no see." After saying this, Dan Qingyang looked at Xiaochen with a faint smile on his face. "Little guy, you're quite mischievous. Well, this old man owes your master a lot of favors. Today, I'll save you." Seeing Dan Qingyang appear, Xiaochen finally breathed a sigh of relief. Previously, Xiaochen had guessed that Tao Ming must have some backup plan. Therefore, a few days before the Coiling Heavens sect arrived in Jian province, Xiaochen had asked Yang Song to go to the Dan Valley in hopes of persuading Dan Qingyang to help. Of course, the reason why Xiaochen chose to ask Dan Qingyang for help was because of the previous incident. Previously, Dan Qingyang had opened the 100 Spirits Mystery Realm for him and the others to cultivate. Since then, Xiaochen believed that Dan Qingyang might have a good relationship with his master, Jun Wuya. In this case, perhaps Dan Qingyang would help. He was just trying to give it a try, but now it seemed that he had made the right bet. Dan Qingyang's appearance greatly resolved Xiaochen's crisis, but for Tao Ming, Dan Qingyang's appearance made him angry. Tao Ming looked coldly at Dan Qingyang and said coldly, "Dan Qingyang, what do you mean? Doesn't the Dan Valley not participate in the affairs of other forces?" The Dan Valley had never participated in the struggles of other forces in the Great Thousand World. Hearing this, Dan Qingyang smiled and said, "I have no intention of interfering, but this little guy is the disciple of the Sovereign Emperor. I don't want to see him die, so I came here to protect him. That's all." Dan Qingyang did not hide his intentions. He came here to protect Xiaochen. Hearing this, the coldness in Tao Ming's eyes deepened, and he immediately scolded Dan Qingyang. "Dan Qingyang, I must kill this boy today. Are you sure you want to stop me?" "This boy cannot be killed," Dan Qingyang said flatly. Xiaochen was someone Tao Ming must kill. If he did not kill him, the sword sect might come back to life. Therefore, Tao Ming could let anyone go, but not Xiaochen. However, Dan Qingyang came here to protect Xiaochen. Both of them refused to budge an inch. Seeing this, Tao Ming suddenly threw out a punch, attacking Dan Qingyang. Facing Tao Ming's attack, Dan Qingyang smiled helplessly and said, "I haven't fought with anyone for many years." As the Valley Master of the Dan Valley, Dan Qingyang was not only a sovereign emperor, but he was also an alchemist. To be honest, as an alchemist, Dan Qingyang did not like fighting, but he had no choice today. Tao Ming was obviously unwilling to let Xiaochen go, so he could only fight. As soon as he finished speaking, Dan Qingyang gently pointed his finger, and it collided with Tao Ming's fist. Immediately, the place where the two exchanged blows instantly collapsed. With a head-on collision, the sky seemed to be torn apart, and the ground collapsed layer by layer. The power of this exchange was terrifying, but this was just the beginning. After the head-on collision, Tao Ming did not hesitate and punched out again, and the two immediately engaged in a fierce battle. Please add me to your collection, monthly vote, recommend me. Chapter 2033. Tao Ming and Dan Qingyang engaged in a fierce battle. It was another battle between two emperor-level masters. For a moment, many experts from both sides were shocked. Tao Ming and Dan Qingyang engaged in a fierce battle. It was another battle between two emperor-level masters. For a moment, many experts from both sides were shocked. However, with the appearance of Dan Qingyang, the experts from the Sword Sect and the Moon Palace heaved a sigh of relief. After all, Dan Qingyang's appearance had indeed blocked Tao Ming. At the beginning, Yun Chen's appearance had caused the hearts of the experts from the Sword Sect and the Moon Palace to sink. However, with the appearance of Dan Qingyang, the entire situation had obviously been reversed. Even Luo Xing, who was engaged in a fierce battle with Yun Chen, was relieved. He looked at Yun Chen and sneered, "Yun Chen, it seems that your wishful thinking is going to fail this time." Luo Xing had not expected Xiao Chen to invite Dan Qingyang. However, no matter what, Xiao Chen's move could be said to be extremely ingenious. At least, it had completely disrupted Tao Ming and Yun Chen's plan. Luo Xing was relieved, but on the other side, Tao Ming was very irritated. He had thought that with Yun Chen holding Luo Xing back, he could easily kill Xiao Chen. However, Dan Qingyang had appeared in the end. Tao Ming shouted coldly as he engaged in a fierce battle with Dan Qingyang. Dan Qingyang, the Sword Sect and Dan Valley are not related. Are you sure you want to fight? Dan Valley had always been neutral and had never participated in the battles of other forces. Therefore, Tao Ming had not expected Dan Qingyang's appearance this time. Hearing Tao Ming's words, Dan Qingyang said indifferently, "Tao Ming, with me here today, you won't be able to kill Xiao Chen." Stop! With Dan Qingyang's interference, it was indeed difficult for Tao Ming to attack Xiao Chen. However, when he heard Dan Qingyang's words, Tao Ming's face revealed a cold expression. "Dan Qingyang, are you sure you can stop me?" Dan Qingyang was also an emperor-level figure. However, among the emperor-level figures in the Great Thousand World, Dan Qingyang's combat strength was actually not high. It could even be said that he was ranked at the bottom. After all, Dan Qingyang was an alchemist, and alchemists were not known for their combat prowess. Therefore, even though Dan Qingyang and Tao Ming were both emperors, in terms of combat prowess, Dan Qingyang was not Tao Ming's opponent. Alchemists, Dan Qing, Dan, and Dan. Alchemists usually, they would not have extraordinary combat strength. Instead, they would have studied alchemy pill art yang. In order to kill Xiao Chen and destroy the Sword Sect, Tao Ming did not care about anything else. In fact, in Tao Ming's heart, he did not want to become enemies with Dan Valley. However, there was no other way. Who asked Dan Qingyang to protect Xiao Chen? In the Great Thousand World, offending Dan Valley was not something that one could easily do. After all, any cultivator in any force needed the support of elixirs. Dan Valley controlled more than half of the elixirs in the Great Thousand World, especially those high-grade elixirs. Basically, only Dan Valley could refine them. Offending Dan Valley was not good news for any force. However, at this time, in order to destroy the Sword Sect and kill Xiao Chen, Tao Ming could not care less. First, he had to destroy the Sword Sect and kill Xiao Chen. Everything else could be dealt with later. As for offending Dan Valley, Tao Ming had no choice but to make up for it in the future. As soon as he finished speaking, a monstrous power suddenly rose from Tao Ming's body. At the same time, thick black clouds began to gather in the sky. Lightning bolts rained down from the black clouds. The black clouds and lightning enveloped Dan Qingyang and Tao Ming. Looking at Dan Qingyang, Tao Ming's eyes were filled with coldness as he spoke coldly. "Dan Qingyang, I'm sorry to offend you. In terms of connections, experience, and prestige in the Great Thousand World, Tao Ming might not be comparable to Dan Qingyang. After all, Dan Qingyang had been an Emperor Realm figure for many years and was also the Valley Master of Dan Valley. However, in terms of combat strength, Tao Ming was confident that he could defeat Dan Qingyang. Hearing Tao Ming's words, Dan Qingyang's face darkened. "Tao Ming, are you so unwilling to let go of the Sword Sect? Today, the Sword Sect will be destroyed." "No one can stop me," Tao Ming said coldly. As soon as Tao Ming finished speaking, a thick bolt of lightning fell from the sky and struck Tao Ming's body. Bathed in the lightning, Tao Ming's aura continued to soar. At the same time, terrifying lightning bolts seemed to appear around Tao Ming's body. "Body of the Thunder Emperor," Tao Ming shouted in a low voice. His entire body seemed to have transformed into a bolt of lightning. His aura was extremely terrifying. At the same time, Tao Ming took a step forward and disappeared into thin air. Looking at Tao Ming's movements, Dan Qingyang frowned and said, "So fast." Tao Ming's speed was indeed fast. Even among the Emperor realm, he could be considered one of the best. Facing Tao Ming, who had used his trump card, Dan Qingyang's mood was a little heavy. Tao Ming was an orthodox Emperor realm figure. His combat strength was very strong, which was completely different from Dan Qingyang. At this time, facing Tao Ming, who had disappeared, Dan Qingyang found it difficult to even catch his movements. His body could not keep up with Dan Qingyang's speed. In the blink of an eye, Tao Ming had appeared behind Dan Qingyang and struck out with his palm. Sensing the danger, Dan Qingyang immediately tried to resist, but he was still forced back a few steps by Tao Ming. It was completely different from before. The body of the Thunder Emperor was Tao Ming's trump card. It was also his foundation. In the Great Thousand World, Tao Ming's body of the Thunder Emperor was extremely famous. After forcing Dan Qingyang back with his palm, Tao Ming did not stop and chased after Dan Qingyang. Facing Tao Ming's extreme speed, Dan Qingyang naturally found it more and more difficult to deal with him. In an instant, the two of them had exchanged hundreds of blows. Dan Qingyang was undoubtedly at a disadvantage. It was difficult for him to contend with Tao Ming, at least in terms of combat strength. At this moment, Dan Qingyang's weakness as an alchemist was completely exposed. Tao Ming's intention was also very obvious. He wanted to defeat Dan Qingyang. Dan Qingyang was struggling to hold on, but it seemed like it was only a matter of time before he was defeated. Seeing that the situation between Tao Ming and Dan Qingyang had completely changed, and Dan Qingyang was firmly suppressed by Tao Ming, Yun Chen, who was on the other side, once again revealed a faint smile. "It seems that Dan Qingyang can't protect that boy today." Dan Qingyang was indeed unable to protect Xiaochen, at least in front of Tao Ming, who was serious. Hearing this, Luo Xing's eyes flashed coldly as he spoke. "This lunatic, does he not care about the consequences of doing this? Please add, recommend, and vote." Chapter 2034. Dan Qingyang's combat strength was indeed at the bottom of the sovereigns, but for so many years, the sovereigns of the Great Thousand World had treated him with respect. This was because Dan Qingyang was the #1 alchemist in the Great Thousand World, and he also controlled Dan Valley. These two identities should not be underestimated. Although their combat strength was not good, what would the consequences be if Dan Valley cut off a force's supply of elixirs? No force could do without the support of elixirs, and everyone knew this. This was why Luo Xing said that Tao Ming was really crazy. In order to destroy the Sword Sect, he did not hesitate to offend Dan Qingyang. Did he know the consequences of doing so? Moreover, although Dan Qingyang was being suppressed by Tao Ming, Luo Xing could guarantee that even if Tao Ming had the guts, he would not dare to do anything to Dan Qingyang. If Tao Ming really killed Dan Qingyang, there was no doubt that the Kadian sect would soon be removed from the Great Thousand World, even if it was one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. In order to destroy the Sword Sect and kill Xiaochen, Tao Ming was already somewhat disregarding the consequences. Perhaps Tao Ming was thinking of killing Xiaochen first and destroying the Sword Sect, and other matters could be dealt with later. At most, he would give some compensation to Dan Valley. Tao Ming indeed did not think of killing Dan Qingyang. He knew very well that Dan Qingyang could not be killed. Based on his status as the #1 alchemist in the Great Thousand World, there were many people who would not let anything happen to Dan Qingyang. Therefore, although Tao Ming was suppressing Dan Qingyang at this time, he did not have the slightest intention to kill him. He forced Dan Qingyang to retreat step by step. At this time, Tao Ming's face revealed a look of determination as he spoke to Dan Qingyang. "Dan Qingyang, I have offended you today. I will personally visit you in the future." After saying this, Tao Ming did not wait for Dan Qingyang's reply. In a flash, he directly charged toward Xiao Chen. He had already forced Dan Qingyang to retreat. At this time, Dan Qingyang could no longer stop Tao Ming's attack. After all, in terms of speed, Dan Qingyang was definitely no match for Tao Ming, who had unleashed the Lightning Emperor's body. Tao Ming wanted to kill Xiao Chen with a single strike. However, he wasn't happy at all because this operation against the Sword Sect wasn't going smoothly for him. It could even be said that it was filled with difficulties. Moreover, in order to destroy the Sword Sect, Tao Ming had also offended the Dan Valley. Tao Ming did not know how to make amends for this. However, these were all matters for the future. At this point, Xiao Chen had to die, and the Sword Sect had to be destroyed. Tao Ming immediately prepared to strike with his palm. Facing Xiao Chen, Tao Ming naturally would not hold back, much less give him any chance. Enveloped by Tao Ming's aura, Xiao Chen could not even muster the slightest intention to resist. A venerable emperor-level figure was not someone Xiao Chen could contend with at the moment. Xiao Chen didn't know what he was feeling. Facing Tao Ming, he seemed to have even forgotten his fear. He could only watch as Tao Ming charged towards him. Am I going to die? Just as Xiao Chen thought so, at this critical moment, a dragon's roar suddenly came from the sky. Immediately, another spatial crack appeared in front of Xiao Chen. Along with the appearance of this spatial crack, a terrifying pressure from the Dragon Clan spread out. Seeing this scene, Tao Ming's face darkened again. However, he did not stop his movements. He still directly slammed his palm towards Xiao Chen. Xiao Chen would definitely not be able to block Tao Ming's palm. There was no doubt about that. However, just as the palm fell, a green light rushed out from the spatial crack and collided with Tao Ming's palm. The two collided and immediately cancelled each other out. No one knew who had blocked Tao Ming's palm for Xiao Chen. Tao Ming's face had completely darkened. He did not understand why there would be so much resistance to killing a mere Xiao Chen. First, it was Luo Xing, then it was Dan Qingyang, and now someone had stepped forward to stop him. The development of the situation was completely different from what Tao Ming had expected. One after another, people stepped forward to protect Xiao Chen. This made Tao Ming even angrier. His gaze was fixed on the spatial crack in front of Xiao Chen. Immediately, a tall and strong old man and a young girl slowly walked out of it. The young girl was Xiao Chen's second sister, Long Qing. After walking out of the spatial crack, Long Qing immediately came to Xiao Chen's side and asked with concern, "Little brother, are you all right?" "Second sister, why are you here?" Seeing that it was Long Qing, Xiao Chen was stunned. He did not expect Long Qing to appear here. Hearing this, Long Qing said snappily, "If I didn't come, you would have died." Long Qing had appeared here to save Xiao Chen. At the same time, while the two were talking, Tao Ming also said to the old man with an ugly expression, "Long Yuan, what do you mean?" The old man was called Long Yuan, and he was Long Qing's current master. At the same time, he was also the ancestor of the Dragon Palace. Like Tao Ming and Dan Qingyang, he was also an emperor and was called the Dragon Emperor. Facing Tao Ming, whose face was gloomy and eyes filled with anger, Long Yuan chuckled softly. "Tao Ming, you are becoming more and more lawless. You even dared to attack Dan Qingyang. Aren't you afraid that the other emperors of the Great Thousand World will gang up on you?" His voice was full of sarcasm. After saying this, Long Yuan no longer paid attention to Tao Ming. Instead, he turned his gaze to Dan Qingyang. "Dan Qingyang, I haven't seen you for many years, but I really didn't expect that one day you would fall into such a situation." Naturally, Long Yuan and Dan Qingyang knew each other. Hearing this, Dan Qingyang smiled helplessly and said, "You know that I am not good at fighting. There is nothing I can do about it." Dan Qingyang did not deny the fact that his combat strength was low. After all, he did not need to prove anything with his combat strength. Moreover, the emperors in the Great Thousand World had never valued Dan Qingyang's combat strength. As an alchemist, whether his combat strength was strong or weak did not mean much. Hearing Dan Qingyang's words, Long Yuan smiled slightly. At the same time, facing the sudden appearance of Long Yuan, Tao Ming's face was already ugly enough to be described as ugly. Long Yuan was different from Dan Qingyang. He wasn't an alchemist, but a genuine Emperor realm cultivator with great battle prowess. Facing Long Yuan was much more stressful than facing Dan Qingyang. To be honest, Tao Ming did not think that he had much of a chance of winning against Long Yuan. At most, it would be a 50-50 chance. After all, Long Yuan was a veteran emperor, and no one knew how strong he was. Tao Ming did not expect Long Yuan to appear here. While Tao Ming was in a daze, Long Yuan retracted his gaze and looked at him indifferently. Emperor Ming Wang, what's the point of bullying an alchemist in terms of combat strength? Why don't you and I have a fight? It just so happens that this old man hasn't fought for many years. Let's see if rising stars like you are as terrifying as the rumors say. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2035. In terms of combat strength, Dan Qingyang was no match for Tao Ming, but Long Yuan was completely different. Long Yuan was not an alchemist. As an emperor-level figure, Long Yuan was known for his combat strength. In terms of combat strength, Dan Qingyang was no match for Tao Ming, but Long Yuan was completely different. Long Yuan was not an alchemist. As an emperor-level figure, Long Yuan was known for his combat strength. Moreover, in terms of seniority, Long Yuan had become famous much earlier than Tao Ming. Before Tao Ming became an emperor-level figure, Long Yuan was already famous in the Great Thousand World. In fact, Tao Ming was Long Yuan's junior. Indeed, he had not fought with anyone for many years. However, with the ancestral dragon bloodline and the old ancestor of the Dragon Palace, Long Yuan's combat strength was definitely not to be underestimated. Although Tao Ming and Long Yuan had not fought before, Tao Ming did not have the slightest confidence of winning if they really fought. Tao Ming looked at Long Yuan with an extremely cold gaze. One Dan Qingyang was enough, but now another Long Yuan had appeared. Tao Ming's mood was naturally imaginable. Fight? Tao Ming hesitated in his heart. He did not have the slightest confidence to fight against Long Yuan. Moreover, just as Tao Ming was hesitating in his heart, Dan Qingyang, who was standing by the side, said plainly, "Stop it, Emperor Ming Wang. There is no need to continue this battle. If you insist on fighting, then I can only make sure that the people of the Heavenly Sect will not be able to return." Dan Qingyang's words made Tao Ming's eyes even colder. What did he mean? Dan Qingyang was going to attack the other people of the Heavenly Sect? If that was the case, Tao Ming could imagine the consequences even if he used his toes to think. Moreover, in the current situation, even if Dan Qingyang really did so, Tao Ming could not do anything because there was still Long Yuan in front of him. With Long Yuan here, Tao Ming obviously could not stop Dan Qingyang. In addition, Yun Qin was entangled with Luo Xing Tao Ming and Yun Qin could not do anything. It seemed that if Dan Qingyang really attacked the other people of the Heavenly Sect, the two of them obviously could not do anything. Allowing an Emperor Realm expert to attack End Realm and Dao Realm experts of the Heavenly Sect was undoubtedly a disaster. Tao Ming's heart was filled with disbelief, but at this moment, the situation had been completely reversed. The appearance of Dan Qingyang and Long Yuan had completely caught Tao Ming off guard. Two sovereigns had actually stood up to protect the Sword Gate. Tao Ming cursed inwardly. He thought that with Yun Qin holding Luo Xing back, it would be a piece of cake for him to destroy the Sword Sect. However, the tables had turned. Tao Ming and Yun Qin were being held back by Luo Xing and Long Yuan, so Dan Qingyang was free. He knew that Dan Qingyang didn't like fighting, but as an Emperor Realm Master, Dan Qingyang would never joke about this matter. He knew very well that if he insisted on fighting, then Coiling Heaven's sect would suffer heavy casualties in the future. After all, without Tao Ming's interference, who in the Heavenly Sect could stop Dan Qingyang? At that time, he would be like a tiger in a flock of sheep. Tao Ming's cold and angry gaze swept back and forth between Long Yuan and Dan Qingyang. In the end, he had no choice but to back down. Under the protection of 3 emperors, Tao Ming knew very well that it was impossible to destroy the sword sect today. If he forcefully attacked, he was afraid that merging heaven's sect would be destroyed before the sword sect was destroyed. Long Yuan and the other 2 shouldn't be underestimated. In addition to their own strength, the 3 of them had a huge force behind them. Dragon Palace was behind Long Yuan, and Dan Valley was behind Dan Qingyang. Although the 2 of them had come alone, if they were to really fight, merging heaven's sect would be fighting against 3 of the 10 great Ling Tian sects at the same time. One could imagine the final result if they were to fight 1 against 3. Tao Ming was extremely unwilling to let his original plan go down the drain. However, there was nothing he could do. His cold gaze swept across Long Yuan and Dan Qingyang, then fell on Xiaochen. At this time, accompanied by Long Qing, Xiaochen didn't avoid Tao Ming's gaze. Their eyes met, and Tao Ming said coldly, well, boy, I'd like to see how long they can protect your sword sect. Emperor Ming Wang, do you not want to leave? Long Yuan sneered when he heard Tao Ming's words. Before leaving, he didn't forget to threaten Xiaochen. However, Tao Ming's face darkened when he heard Long Yuan's words, and he immediately shouted, let's go. With Tao Ming's order, the experts of merging heaven's sect naturally chose to retreat immediately. After all, they weren't stupid. Although they were in the midst of a fierce battle, they still had some understanding of the situation. Now that 3 emperors had stepped forward to protect the sword sect, it was naturally impossible to destroy the sword sect under such circumstances. Therefore, with Tao Ming's order, the experts of merging heaven's sect naturally chose to retreat without hesitation. Tao Ming chose to give up in the end. In this regard, Yunchen naturally wouldn't continue to be entangled with Luo Xing. Looking at Luo Xing, Yunchen smiled and said, Emperor Luo Xing, we'll meet again in the future. As soon as he finished speaking, Yun Chen's figure disappeared from the spot. The experts of merging heaven's sect quickly retreated. At the same time, Luo Xing also came in front of Long Yuan and Dan Qingyang. Luo Xing didn't expect the 2 of them to appear. However, no matter what, the 2 of them had indeed helped a lot. Otherwise, it would be difficult for Luo Xing to deal with Yun Chen and Tao Ming by himself. Just as Luo Xing and the other 2 smiled at each other, Xiaochen, accompanied by Long Qing, also came in front of the 3 of them. Xiaochen had already met Dan Qingyang before, but this was the first time Long Yuan had met him. After cupping his hands and bowing to the 3 of them, Xiaochen took the initiative to speak. Junior thanks the 3 seniors for saving us. Xiaochen naturally had to thank the 3 of them for saving him. However, just as Xiaochen finished speaking, Long Qing spoke to Long Yuan in a somewhat coquettish manner. Master, why didn't you kill Tao Ming and let him go just like that? Hearing Long Qing's words, Long Yuan smiled bitterly and said, do you really think that an Emperor Realm expert is a cabbage that can be found anywhere? You can kill him just like that? Even if Dan Qingyang and I join forces, it won't be easy to kill Tao Ming. Long Qing's attitude towards Long Yuan was very casual. From this, it could be seen that Long Yuan was very tolerant and caring towards Long Qing. Perhaps in Long Yuan's heart, he had long regarded Long Qing as his own descendant. After all, both of them were from the pureblood dragon tribe and also possessed the ancestral dragon bloodline. This was very normal. Looking at Long Qing and Long Yuan, Xiaochen revealed a smile. Long Qing was doing well in the Dragon Palace, so Xiaochen was relieved. Moreover, this time, he really had to thank Long Qing and Long Yuan. If they hadn't arrived in time, he would have been in danger. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2036. With Tao Ming's retreat, the sword sect's crisis was temporarily resolved. Moreover, Tao Ming had personally led the heavenly sect this time, but it still ended in failure. It seemed like the heavenly sect wouldn't have any thoughts about the sword sect for a long time. The heavenly sect had gone all out to attack the sword sect this time. Tao Ming had even invited Yun City to help him. But even so, it still ended in failure. It could be said that there were no tricks involved in this victory. Although the Sword Sect definitely couldn't stop the Heavenly Sect with its strength, and they had relied on external forces to succeed this time, no matter what, the Heavenly Sect definitely couldn't do anything to the Sword Sect as long as Lam Yuan, Luo Xing, and Dan Qingyang were there. Moreover, since the three of them had taken action once, who could guarantee that they wouldn't protect the Sword Sect a second time? In this way, as long as Tao Ming wasn't stupid, he knew that it was impossible to destroy the Sword Sect. At least before he found a new ally, he couldn't do anything to the Sword Sect under the protection of Luo Xing, and Dan Qingyang. Without the threat from the Heavenly Sect, everyone in the Sword Sect heaved a sigh of relief. To be honest, everyone in the Sword Sect could be said to be extremely nervous in the face of the constant pressure from the Heavenly Sect. Now that the crisis was resolved, everyone smiled as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders. Moreover, after this incident, the Sword Sect was able to withstand the enormous pressure from the Heavenly Sect. This made everyone in the Sword Sect even more confident that the Sword Sect would definitely be able to return to its former glory in the future. Today was a day worth celebrating. As the sect master of the Sword Sect, Xiaochen also invited Lam Yuan, Dan Qingyang, and Luo Xing to the Sword Palace. The three of them didn't refuse. The group returned to the Sword Palace. Of course, Xiaochen also left Sang Xing behind to keep an eye on the movements of the Heavenly Gate and see if they were really going to retreat. The battle came and went quickly. The Heavenly Gate had come aggressively, but in the end, they left with their tails between their legs. The outcome of the battle naturally spread throughout the Great Thousand World. After all, the Heavenly Sect had launched a large-scale attack on the Sword Sect, and Tao Ming had personally led the team. This naturally attracted the attention of the various forces in the Great Thousand World. At this moment, the spies of the various forces naturally reported back to their respective forces. The Black Emperor sect, which was close to the Sword Sect, was the first to receive the news. At this moment, He Sui sat in the garden with a complicated expression in a cave of the Black Emperor sect. He had already received the news that the Heavenly Union sect had been defeated. He Sui smiled bitterly as he looked at Zhao Chenfeng. Even the coiling Heaven Gate can't do anything? If that's the case, the rise of the Sword Sect is already unstoppable. He Sui sighed softly. The coiling Heaven Gate had no way to take down the Sword Sect, and this time, Tao Ming had personally taken action, in addition to Yun Chen. Two emperors had taken action at the same time, but they were still unable to take down the Sword Sect. In He Sui's opinion, this already indicated that the rise of the Sword Sect was unstoppable. Hearing He Sui's words, Zhao Chenfeng also sighed helplessly. The coiling Heaven Gate had been defeated. Who would have thought that such an outcome would occur? The rise of the Sword Sect had a huge impact on the Black Emperor sect. It was not because of anything else, but because the two sects could almost be said to be close to each other. The Jian province and the Ba province were separated by a fine line. If the Sword Sect really grew, He Sui believed that it would not be long before Xiao Chen's eyes fell on the Black Emperor sect. After all, how could he allow others to sleep beside him? He Sui's heart was a little heavy. At the same time, on the other side, in the Tai Ching Temple in the Dao province, tens of thousands of miles away, Daoist Bai Song had also received the news of the coiling Heaven Gate's defeat. Standing alone on the mountain peak, Daoist Bai Song looked in the direction of the Jian province with a complicated expression as he muttered to himself. Looks like the world is really going to change. Is this the foundation of the 10 great Ling Tian sects? Daoist Bai Song also understood that after this battle, the rise of the Sword Sect was indeed unstoppable. It had already shown the trend of a single spark starting a prairie fire. However, compared to the Black Emperor sect, the rise of the Sword Sect was not much of a threat to the Tai Ching Temple. After all, the Jian province and the Dao province were very far apart, and Xiaochen could not possibly go against the Tai Ching Temple, right? The two sects did not have any conflicts, so the rise of the Sword Sect did not have much of an impact on the Tai Ching Temple. Daoist Bai Song was just sighing. Almost on the same day, the various forces in the Great Thousand World received the news of the coiling Heaven Gate's retreat and the Sword Sect's victory. At the same time, they also knew that in the face of the coiling Heaven Gate's attack, the three emperors, Luo Xing, Long Yuan, and Dan Qingyang, stood out to protect the sword sect at the same time. While the various forces were shocked that Long Yuan, Luo Xing, and Dan Qingyang supported the sword sect, they also quickly found out the relationship between the sword sect and the three forces. Needless to say, Luo Xing and Dan Qingyang had taken action because of Jun Wuya. As for Long Yuan, it was because of Xiao Chen's second sister, Long Qing. Long Qing was originally a very unfamiliar name in the Great Thousand World, but at this moment, it was known by the leaders of the various forces. Everyone knew that Lin Qing was the young supreme talent who showed the ancestral dragon's bloodline at the Six Sect competition. Moreover, she seemed to be the second sister of the sword sect's leader, Xiao Chen. However, Long Qing had now become the disciple of the Dragon Emperor, Long Yuan, the ancestor of the Dragon Palace. It was no wonder that Long Yuan would personally support the sword sect. It turned out that there was such a relationship. Behind the sword sect stood 3 of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Although it was difficult to say about the Dan Valley, after all, the Dan Valley had never participated in the battle between the various forces. Even without the Dan Valley, the sword sect had the protection of the Moon Palace and the Dragon Palace. In this way, the sword sect's safety could be said to be almost guaranteed. Even the coiling Heaven Gate could only return in defeat, right? In the face of such a shocking result, the various forces also changed their attitude towards the sword sect. At the same time, because of this victory, the sword sect's control over the sword province in Wuzhou became more stable. The large and small forces in the 2 provinces were now completely loyal to the sword sect. The 2 provinces' forces surrendered because, firstly, the sword sect's momentum was at its peak. Secondly, it was because they saw the future of the sword sect. If the sword sect could return to its former glory in the future, then the benefits that they, as the subordinate forces of the sword sect, would be able to obtain would definitely not be small. Therefore, at this moment, the large and small forces in the sword province in Wuzhou resolutely decided to follow the footsteps of the sword sect and tightly hug the big tree that was the sword sect. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2037. The sword sect once again withstood the attack of the heavenly sect, which made everyone in the sword sect unite against a common enemy. From the deputy sect masters of the sword sect like Zhang Xing to the ordinary disciples, they were all full of confidence in the future of the sword sect. The sword sect once again withstood the attack of the heavenly sect, which made everyone in the sword sect unite against a common enemy. From the deputy sect masters of the sword sect like Zhang Xing to the ordinary disciples, they were all full of confidence in the future of the sword sect. Not only was the sword sect not defeated by the heavenly sect, but it was also a blessing in disguise. The sword sect seemed to be more confident and powerful than before. Xiao Chen naturally saw the changes in the sword sect and felt happy in his heart. After a celebration, Dan Qingyang left the sword sect the next day. Then, he stayed for another day. Long Yuan was also preparing to take Long Qing back to the Dragon Palace. Xiao Chen was not worried about Long Qing's return to the Dragon Palace. Judging from Long Yuan's behavior, he really treated Long Qing well. Long Qing personally came to see Long Yuan off. Before they parted, she looked at Xiao Chen and said, "Little brother, the heavenly sect probably hasn't given up yet. Be careful. If there's anything, remember to tell me." Long Qing was still a little worried about the heavenly sect. After all, although the heavenly sect retreated this time, it seemed that Tao Ming had not given up. Once there was a chance, Tao Ming would still choose to attack the sword sect. Hearing Long Qing's words, Xiao Chen nodded and said, "I know. Second sister, you too. Be careful when you go to the Dragon Palace." The two exchanged a few words of advice. Then, Long Qing left the sword sect under the lead of Long Yuan. Dan Qingyang and Long Yuan left one after another. In the end, Luo Xing also led the cultivators of Moon Palace back to Moon Province. After all, the battle was over, and Heavenly Gate had been defeated. Therefore, the cultivators of Moon Palace naturally had to return. With Luo Xing, Lang Yuan, and Dan Qingyang's departure, peace returned to the Sword Sect. Many disciples of the Sword Sect resumed their daily cultivation. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. During this month, the Heavenly Sect didn't do anything out of the ordinary, and the Sword Sect also had a rare moment of peace. However, during this period of time, something huge happened within the Sword Sect. Firstly, Yang Song, Zhao Yu, Qian Ling, and Li Sui headed to the Dan Valley to search for a chance to break through to End Realm. When Xiaochen mentioned this matter to Dan Qingyang agreed without hesitation. Of course, Xiaochen had paid a hefty price for this. Moreover, entering the Pill Tomb didn't mean that one would definitely be able to break through to End Realm. As for whether the outcome was good or bad, it would depend on Yang Song and the others. Apart from Yang Song and the others heading to the Dan Valley to search for a chance to break through to End Realm, there was another huge matter. That was that Wuzhou had completely merged into Jianzhou. From today onwards, there would no longer be a Wuzhou in the Great Thousand World. After merging with Wuzhou, the original Jianzhou had nearly doubled in size. Although this month was short, everything seemed to be developing in a good direction for the Sword Sect. Compared to the prosperity of the Sword Sect, He Sui's mood in Bazhou, which was right next to Jianzhou, was a little heavy. The stronger the Sword Sect was, the greater the pressure in He Sui's heart. Although the Sword Sect didn't show any intentions of attacking the Black Emperor Sect, this was only temporary. When the Sword Sect was strong enough, would the Sword Sect allow a superpower to exist beside them? They obviously wouldn't. Moreover, what worried He Sui the most was the growth of the Sword Sect. It was too quick. It could be said that it was changing 3 times a day. It was hard to imagine how much the Sword Sect would grow if it was given a few more decades. It wasn't that He Sui didn't think about striking first to gain the upper hand, but now, the Sword Sect was stronger than the Black Emperor Sect. They had 6 End Realm experts, which was 1 more than the Black Emperor Sect. Such strength wasn't something that the Black Emperor Sect could take down. This was why attacking the Sword Sect wasn't a wise choice. It could even be said that it was a stupid choice. The Black Emperor Sect was already unable to stop the rise of the Sword Sect. However, the 2 sects were so close to each other, which was why He Sui was so conflicted and worried. On this day, within the main hall of the Black Emperor Sect, He Sui and the 4 princes of the Black Emperor Sect were gathered together. Everyone was discussing the Sword Sect. Looking at He Sui, Zhao Qinfeng said in his heart, "Sect leader, the Sword Sect is becoming more and more popular. There are already some powers in Bazhou that want to join the Sword Sect. Some powers in Bazhou were already tempted to move to Jianzhou and become a subsidiary power of the Sword Sect. Such thoughts were normal. Humans wanted to climb higher and water flowed lower. Anyways, they were all subsidiary powers. Now that the Sword Sect was like the sun in the sky, why not choose the Sword Sect that had more hope than becoming a subsidiary power of the Black Emperor Sect? This was what most people thought. Hearing Zhao Qinfeng's words, He Sui wasn't too surprised, like he had guessed it long ago. Bazhou was right next to Jianzhou. Along with the rise of the Sword Sect, Bazhou would naturally be affected. This was a normal thing. Moreover, He Sui didn't have time to care about the subsidiary powers. In his heart, the most important thing was where the Black Emperor Sect should go from here. He kept silent and no one knew what He Sui was thinking. Just as the Black Emperor Sect was feeling pressured because of the Sword Sect, on the other side, the Sword Sect attracted another End Realm expert. The fact that the Sword Gate had blocked 2 consecutive attacks from the Heavenly Sect had undoubtedly raised the status of the Sword Gate in the hearts of many sword cultivators in the Great Thousand World. As a result, many sword cultivators once again regarded the Sword Gate as a holy land in their hearts, especially those rogue cultivators. On this day, an old man called Qin Lin took the initiative to visit the Sword Sect and expressed that he was willing to join the Sword Sect. Qin Lin was an End Realm expert of the older generation. Before this, he was the head of a small family. However, many years ago, his family was wiped out. Qin Lin cultivated alone and roamed the world. During this period, he obtained many fortuitous encounters and finally broke through to the End Realm. Then, he took revenge for his family. Qin Lin's arrival made Xiaochen really happy. One more End Realm expert meant that the sword sect was stronger. Moreover, Qin Lin and Sangxing were really close. Based on what Sangxing said, he didn't need to worry about Qin Lin's identity. This person didn't belong to any sect, so joining the sword sect wouldn't be a problem. There was no need to doubt Qin Lin's motive for joining the sword sect. With that, Xiaochen heaved a sigh of relief. Within the main hall of the sword sect, Xiaochen was accompanied by Sangxing to personally meet Qin Lin. He was a normal old man in rough clothes. He didn't look special at all. When he saw Xiaochen, Qin Lin cupped his hands and bowed, "Greetings, sect leader." Chapter 2038. Qin Lin took the initiative to greet Xiaochen. Seeing this, Xiaochen personally helped him up and said with a smile, "Senior is too polite." Qin Lin took the initiative to greet Xiaochen. Seeing this, Xiaochen also personally helped him up and said with a smile, "Senior is too polite." This was the first time Xiaochen met Qin Lin, but Sangxing and Qin Lin were very familiar. When Xiaochen said this, Sangxing laughed and teased, "You old fellow, last time I invited you to join the sword sect and you didn't accept. Why did you take the initiative to come to me this time?" Actually, when Xiaochen just became the sect leader of the sword sect, Sangxing had invited Qin Lin. Unfortunately, Qin Lin didn't want to join the sword sect at that time, so he politely rejected. Sangxing couldn't force him. However, who would have thought that this time, Qin Lin actually took the initiative to ask to join the sword sect. This was something that Sangxing didn't expect. Facing Sangxing's teasing, Qin Lin smiled and said, "I'm old, and I need a place to belong. I hope sect leader won't reject me." Qin Lin's words were a little perfunctory. The lifespan of an End Realm expert was extremely long. Although Qin Lin looked like an old man with one foot in the grave, it wouldn't be a problem for him to live for hundreds of years. The reason why Qin Lin didn't choose to join the sword sect and politely rejected Sangxing's invitation was because Qin Lin didn't have high hopes for the sword sect at that time. Now that they had blocked the attacks of the heavenly sect twice, the rise of the sword sect could be said to be unstoppable. Therefore, Qin Lin chose to join the sword sect. For a sect, the stronger it was, the easier it was to attract experts from all around. This was a very simple logic. Hearing Qin Lin's words, Xiaochen clearly didn't care why Qin Lin chose to reject Sangxing's invitation last time. Xiaochen smiled and said, "Senior must be joking. With Senior joining, Junior is more than happy. Why would I reject you?" Xiaochen naturally wouldn't reject Qin Lin's joining. No matter what reason he had for rejecting Sangxing's invitation last time, since Qin Lin took the initiative to come to the sword sect and expressed his willingness to join the sword sect, Xiaochen naturally welcomed him. With Qin Lin joining, the strength of the sword sect undoubtedly increased. Although Qin Lin didn't have any sect behind him and couldn't bring more experts to the sword sect, just the fact that Qin Lin was an End Realm expert was enough for Xiaochen to pay attention to him. Moreover, Qin Lin didn't belong to any sect and didn't have any background. Wouldn't such a person make Xiaochen feel more at ease? He agreed to Qin Lin's joining very straightforwardly. That day, Xiaochen announced that Qin Lin had become the 7th deputy sect leader of the sword sect. At the same time, he held a simple banquet for Qin Lin to welcome him into the sword sect. 7 deputy sect leaders, 7 End Realm experts. In just a few short decades, the strength of the sword sect had undergone a huge change compared to when Xiaochen had just taken over. Thinking back to when Xiaochen had just arrived at the sword sect, there were only 2 End Realm experts in the entire sword sect and one of them had defected. But today, the sword sect had 7 End Realm experts and 12 Dao Realm experts. Their strength had more than doubled from before. With so many experts in charge, the sword sect had become a huge power that couldn't be ignored in the entire world. Along with the sword sect announcing Qin Lin's joining, the entire family was naturally delighted. However, as the saying goes, some families were happy while others were sad. The Sword Sect was delighted because of Qin Lin's joining. As for Yi Sui, who was in Basho, he couldn't eat or sleep well. Another End Realm expert had joined the Sword Sect. With that, the Sword Sect had 7 End Realm experts and their strength increased once more. One had to admit that the current Sword Sect had the ability to wipe out the Black Emperor Sect. The current Yi Sui felt as though he was staying beside a sleeping lion. He had no idea when this sleeping lion would suddenly wake up and bite him fiercely, taking his life. Living next to the Sword Sect, Yi Sui had to be wary at all times. However, what was the use of such caution? He was just lying to himself. When the Sword Sect attacked the Black Emperor Sect, would the Black Emperor Sect have the ability to fight back? The situation seemed to have completely reversed. In the past, the Swords Gate had to constantly be on guard against the threat of the Black Emperor Sect. But now, it was the Black Emperor Sect that had to constantly be on guard against the threat of the Swords Gate. Thinking back to that year, facing the attacks of the Black Emperor Sect, the Sword Sect had to spend a lot of effort to block them. But now, facing the Sword Sect, the Black Emperor Sect felt the same way. He felt like he was going crazy from the pressure. The Swords Gate was like a sharp sword hanging over the Black Emperor Sect's head. As the sect master of the Black Emperor Sect, Yi Sui had to make a corresponding choice. Early in the morning, Yi Sui gathered all the higher-ups of the Black Emperor Sect. Looking at them, Yi Sui said solemnly, "The Sword Sect is getting stronger by the day. Now, they have 7 End Realm experts. We are also neighbors of the Sword Sect. Facing the increasing danger of the Sword Sect, what plans do you all have?" Yi Sui was the first to ask. Hearing this, one of the princes thought about it for a moment before saying, "Sect leader, I feel that we should continue to maintain a friendly relationship with the Sword Sect. With that, we can form an alliance to protect ourselves." Continue to maintain a friendly relationship with the Sword Sect. Hearing this, Yi Sui shook his head and said, "Impossible. As the Sword Sect's strength continues to increase, this balance will be broken sooner or later. The first condition for an alliance is that the difference in strength between the two sides isn't too big. Once there is a clear difference in strength, is there still a possibility of an alliance? If they wanted to continue to coexist peacefully with the Sword Sect, it was best to form an alliance. Yi Sui didn't think highly of this method. If it was before, maybe the Sword Sect would accept it. However, with the current strength of the Sword Sect, how could they form an alliance with the Black Emperor Sect? Have you ever seen a lion form an alliance with a dog? Obviously, it was impossible. There was no need to think about forming an alliance. The Sword Sect definitely wouldn't agree. Now, there were only 2 choices in front of the Black Emperor Sect. Sweeping his gaze across everyone present, Yi Sui's eyes flashed with decisiveness. Then, he said flatly, "Facing the Sword Sect that is getting stronger by the day, if my Black Emperor Sect wants to survive, there are only 2 choices left. The first is to submit, completely submit to the Sword Sect and become a subsidiary power of the Sword Sect. This way, the Black Emperor Sect will be safe. Submit to the Sword Sect? Become a subsidiary power of the Sword Sect?" Hearing this, the upper echelons of the Black Emperor Sect were all stunned. As a superpower, the Black Emperor Sect actually had to submit to the Sword Sect. This was something that everyone found hard to accept. Immediately, someone objected. "Sect leader, our Black Emperor Sect and the Sword Sect are both superpowers. Submitting to the Sword Sect, I hope that Sect leader will reconsider." "That's right, I hope that Sect leader will reconsider." Hearing this person's words, the others all spoke out. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2039. As one of the 6 super first-rate forces, the experts of the Black Emperor Sect were naturally unwilling to submit to the Sword Sect because once they submitted, the Black Emperor Sect would become the laughingstock of the entire Great Thousand World. As one of the 6 super first-rate forces, the experts of the Black Emperor Sect were naturally unwilling to submit to the Sword Sect because once they submitted, the Black Emperor Sect would become the laughingstock of the entire Great Thousand World. He Sui seemed to have guessed that this would be the outcome when faced with the intense opposition from the crowd. Or perhaps, in He Sui's heart, he was also unwilling to submit to the Sword Gate and let the entire Black Emperor sect become a subsidiary force of the Sword Gate. As a result, He Sui spoke indifferently under the intense opposition from the crowd. Then there's only the second option left. At this point, He Sui paused. Everyone present also quietened down. Their gazes fell on He Sui as they waited for him to continue. He Sui continued when he saw that everyone was looking at him. Give up on Bazhou. Now that the Sword Sect is growing stronger by the day, we'll definitely have to fight with the Sword Sect if we continue to stay in Bazhou. As a result, we can only avoid them. Give up on Bazhou and move to a faraway place to develop. This time, all the experts of the Black Emperor sect fell silent when they heard that. They no longer objected as fiercely as before, but no one agreed. After all, the Black Emperor sect had stood in Bazhou for so many years. Now that they had to leave, no one would feel good. Moreover, since they were retreating, no matter how well prepared the Black Emperor sect was, there would definitely be losses because there were some things that could not be taken away. For example, the various major powers in the Bazhou clearly could not leave with the Black Emperor sect. They had stabilized the situation in Bazhou with great difficulty and had used so many years to develop. As a result, once they left, it would mean that all their efforts over the years had been wasted. With the Black Emperor sect's strength, it was not difficult for them to obtain a place in other provinces or become an overlord once again. However, everything had to start from the beginning. Leaving the sect and moving to a new place to settle down was the last thing a sect wanted to see. At the same time, it was not a choice they would make unless they had no other choice. However, the Black Emperor sect no longer had any other choice. As their neighbor, the Sword sect was growing too quickly and was becoming stronger day by day. If the Black Emperor sect continued to stay in Bazhou, it would be destroyed or annexed by the Sword sect sooner or later. As a result, the Black Emperor sect's future was to abandon Bazhou and move to a place far away from the Sword sect to settle down. This was the conclusion that He Sui came to after a long period of contemplation. The Black Emperor sect only had two choices in front of them. One was to submit to Sword's Gate, and the other was to evacuate from the Ba Prefecture and give up everything in the Ba Prefecture to Sword's Gate. Facing the many experts of the Black Emperor sect who had fallen into silence in the hall, He Sui naturally did not feel good in his heart. However, what could he do? The Great Thousand World was so cruel. Sects stood in great numbers and those who were weak would either be destroyed or annexed by another sect. There was no other way. He Sui did not rush the people present. He sat on the main seat and waited for their answers. He gave them enough time to think. In a short period of time, at least for a few years, the Sword's Gate would not make a move against the Black Emperor sect. Therefore, the Black Emperor sect had plenty of time to evacuate. However, in order to minimize the losses, the evacuation work had to begin immediately. That was because one would never know what would happen tomorrow. Although He Sui felt that the Sword sect would not target the Black Emperor sect for a few years, who could guarantee that? Maybe tomorrow, the Sword's Gate would take action against the Black Emperor sect. Who could say for sure? The atmosphere in the hall became very oppressive. It was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. No one said a word. They were all weighing the pros and cons of leaving. There would not be a good outcome if they did not leave. Although they would lose a lot of things if they left, they would at least protect the Black Emperor sect's foundation and allow the Black Emperor sect to rise again. It seemed like a difficult choice, but in reality, the people of the Black Emperor sect did not have any choice unless they were willing to be destroyed by the Sword sect. No one in the hall spoke for more than 2 hours. In the end, Zhao Qinfeng was the first to speak. His voice was filled with unwillingness and helplessness. I agree with Sect Master's decision. Zhao Qinfeng agreed to leave Bazhou. After the first person spoke, the others also expressed their opinions one after another. Although they were unwilling, they knew that some things could not be changed. Recognizing the truth was what they should do. Therefore, even though he was extremely unwilling in his heart, he had no other choice. One after another, everyone expressed their agreement to leave Bazhou. Hearing this, He Sui sighed softly and said, "Let's leave." Everyone, withdrawing does not mean that our Black Emperor sect is finished. On the contrary, withdrawing is to allow our Black Emperor sect to find a future that belongs to us. Currently, the Black Emperor sect is like being trapped in a cage. Only by walking out will we be able to protect the foundation of our Black Emperor sect. Only then will we be able to create a new world for our Black Emperor sect. Although He Sui was extremely unwilling to leave Bazhou, he still opened his mouth to console everyone and let them see hope for the future. Hearing He Sui's words, many people's expressions turned slightly better. Although He Sui's words were a little exaggerated, they did make some sense. Only by abandoning Bazhou and truly leaving to avoid the Sword Sect's edge would the Black Emperor sect be able to survive and create a new world. Everyone had already made their decision. In this way, the Black Emperor sect's departure was a matter that was set in stone. However, even though they had already made their decision, there were still many things that needed to be done. Without mentioning other things, just how many people in the Black Emperor sect were willing to leave with the Black Emperor sect? There was no need to mention the upper echelons. They were absolutely loyal to the Black Emperor sect. However, what about the disciples below? One had to know that the Black Emperor sect had been in the Bazhou for many years. Many of their disciples were people from the Bazhou. Their families and relatives were all in the Bazhou. Would they be willing to leave with the sect? Moreover, the development of a sect not only required the older generation experts, but also the younger generation disciples. Therefore, if these disciples were unwilling to leave with the Black Emperor sect, what would they do? Could it be that the Black Emperor sect would not have a single disciple under them after leaving? These problems needed to be solved urgently. Moreover, these problems were very difficult to solve. After all, the disciples below all had their own thoughts. As the upper echelons of the Black Emperor sect, He Sui and the rest could only think of ways to make them leave with the Black Emperor sect. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2040. The Black Emperor sect had already begun the evacuation work in secret. Since they were going to evacuate, they naturally had to choose a new place as the foundation of the sect. The Black Emperor sect had already begun the evacuation work in secret. Since they were going to evacuate, they naturally had to choose a new place as the foundation of the sect. To the Black Emperor sect, choosing a new province to take root in was actually not a difficult matter. After all, the Black Emperor sect was one of the 6 great first-rate forces no matter what. Ordinary first-rate forces were simply no match for the Black Emperor sect. Therefore, the Black Emperor sect only had one requirement when choosing, and that was to avoid the Sword Sect and the 10 great Ling Tian sects as much as possible. As for the rest, it was not a problem for the Black Emperor sect. The new location was quickly chosen. It was the Lin province that was far away from the Sword province. It was very suitable for the Black Emperor sect to take root here. Firstly, the Lin province was very rich and was completely enough to support the development of the Black Emperor sect. Secondly, there were no powerful forces within the Lin province. Although there were first-rate forces, it was not difficult for the Black Emperor sect. With the Black Emperor sect's strength, they could easily suppress or destroy these first-rate forces. Lastly, and most importantly, there were no powerful sects around the Lin province. No matter if it was the 10 great Ling Tian sects or the other first-rate sects, they were all very far away. As a result, the Black Emperor sect would not encounter a situation like this. He Sui and the other higher-ups of the Black Emperor sect were very satisfied with the Lin province. As a result, since they had chosen the Lin province, the Black Emperor sect quickly began to take action. Firstly, Zhao Qinfeng led a group of Black Emperor sect experts to secretly rush to the Lin province. Firstly, it was to investigate the true situation in the Lin province. Secondly, it was to prepare for the arrival of the Black Emperor sect's main force. Thirdly, it was to choose the future location of the Black Emperor sect. the Black Emperor sect's actions were very secretive. On the surface, it seemed like there was no movement at all, but in reality, the entire Black Emperor sect was already in operation, fully preparing for the evacuation work. The Sword sect did not discover any abnormalities in the Black Emperor sect. Perhaps it was because of the increase in their strength that the Sword sect no longer placed the Black Emperor sect in their eyes. Therefore, the surveillance on the Black Emperor sect had greatly weakened. In any case, the Black Emperor sect did not pose too much of a threat to the Sword sect. As a result, the Black Emperor sect. Currently, the Sword's Gate was still paying full attention to the 10 Ling Tian sects. Therefore, Xiaochen had sent almost all the spies of the Sword's Gate to the Tianzhou to monitor the movements of the Kadian sect. After all, compared to the Kadian sect, the threat of the Black Emperor sect was simply negligible. In the blink of an eye, 3 years passed. In these 3 years, the Sword sect regained its peace. Many disciples were immersed in cultivation every day. Similarly, as the sect leader, Xiaochen was the same. Apart from cultivating, he spent time with his family. Qingshuru, Luan, Shaoqing, and Bairuyue. His days were warm and peaceful. Actually, this was the kind of life that Xiaochen liked. His family was able to be together and not have to worry about anything. There was also no danger. Every day was peaceful and fulfilling. However, Xiaochen was clear that such a life required enough strength to support it. Otherwise, it would be hard to last for too long. He was not blinded by the peace in front of him. On one hand, Xiaochen raised his own strength. On the other hand, he was thinking of ways to strengthen the Sword sect. In 3 years, another End Realm expert and 2 Dao Realm experts joined the Sword sect. Now, there were 8 End Realm experts in the Sword sect. However, compared to the Sword sect's improvement, Xiaochen's own strength was a little helpless. Because he entered the 100 Spirit Secret Realm, Xiaochen couldn't break through for 5 years. This was why during these 3 years, Xiaochen's cultivation didn't improve at all. On this peaceful day, Sangxing hurriedly found Xiaochen. He had a weird expression on his face. Sect leader, something happened in Bazhou. Bazhou? Black Emperor sect? When he heard Sangxing mention Bazhou, the first thing that Xiaochen thought of was Black Emperor sect. However, what could happen to Black Emperor sect? Did the current Black Emperor sect dare to target the Sword sect? That was impossible. With the current strength of the Sword sect, if the Sword sect didn't target Black Emperor sect should be burning incense. Did they dare to offend the Sword sect? Black Emperor sect naturally didn't offend the Sword sect. When Sangxing said that something happened, he didn't mean that. Seeing that Xiaochen misunderstood him, Sangxing didn't keep him in suspense and said directly. The Black Emperor sect has evacuated from the Bazhou. Right now, the Bazhou is in a state of complete chaos. After 3 years of preparation and arrangement, Black Emperor sect had finally left. When he heard Sangxing's words, Xiaochen was stunned. Then, a strange light flashed through his eyes. Tell all the vice sect leaders to gather in the main hall. With Black Emperor sect leaving, Bazhou had no leader, so the Sword sect naturally had to make a move. When he heard this, Sangxing immediately turned around and left to inform the other vice sect leaders. Xiaochen also turned to look at Qingshuru and the other girls. I'll be leaving first. The matter of Bazhou couldn't be delayed, so Xiaochen naturally wouldn't waste any time. While the Sword's Gate was discussing the withdrawal of the Black Emperor sect, on the other side of the Ba Prefecture, the Black Emperor sect withdrew overnight. For a moment, the entire Ba Prefecture was in chaos. Originally, Black Emperor sect was the only overlord in Bazhou without a doubt. However, at this very moment, the overlord had left, leaving behind a group of large and small factions. Without Black Emperor sect's suppression, the rules that Black Emperor sect had set up in the past naturally no longer existed. In just a few short days, the entire Bazhou had descended into endless chaos. For example, 2 factions with grievances. Previously, because the Black Emperor sect was still around, they did not dare to kill in private. But now, without the suppression of the Black Emperor sect, these factions with grievances naturally did not have any scruples and fought. In the short span of a few days, over a dozen large factions had been destroyed in many cities within Bazhou. The smell of blood had almost bewildered the entire Bazhou. Factions fought each other. In addition, there were various bandits and rogue cultivators who began to seize cultivation resources without any qualms. Ethics collapsed and rules were lost. Right now, Bazhou was like hell on earth. Without the restraints of rules, the darkest side of human nature was completely exposed without any qualms. The weak could only be bullied by the strong, while the strong had no qualms. For a time, countless rogue cultivators formed various gangs and began to run amok in Bazhou. They plundered everything, including cultivation resources, treasures, and even women. As long as they took a fancy to something, they would snatch it. If you dared to fight back, they would kill you. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2041. Bazhou was in complete chaos following the withdrawal of the Black Emperor sect. All the powerful native forces in Bazhou wanted to become the overlord of Bazhou, while all the unaffiliated cultivators wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to fish in troubled waters and make a fortune. Bazhou was in complete chaos following the withdrawal of the Black Emperor sect. All the powerful native forces in Bazhou wanted to become the overlord of Bazhou, while all the unaffiliated cultivators wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to fish in troubled waters and make a fortune. As a result, the martialists in Bazhou were in complete chaos. Moreover, it wasn't just the martialists in Bazhou. Many martialists from the surrounding provinces were also pouring into Bazhou. Anyone could see that the current Bazhou was in a state of chaos, and this chaos just so happened to provide them with the opportunity to fight for various cultivation resources. While Bazhou was in chaos, Xiaochen and a group of higher-ups of the Sword Sect gathered in the main hall of the Sword Sect to discuss matters related to Bazhou. Xiaochen really hadn't expected that the Black Emperor sect would actually give up on Bazhou. After all, the Black Emperor sect had been operating in Bazhou for so many years. It wasn't easy for them to give up on Bazhou. However, the facts prove that the Black Emperor sect still chose to give up. As for the reason, Xiaochen, Zhangxing, and the others could guess a little. It was probably because of the Sword Sect. After all, Bazhou and the Sword Sect were too close. The Black Emperor sect felt threatened as the Sword Sect's vision kept getting stronger. In order to protect the Black Emperor sect's inheritance, He Sui chose to withdraw and give up on Bazhou. Xiaochen didn't think that He Sui's choice was wrong. He even thought that He Sui had good foresight. After all, Xiaochen had also thought of taking action against the Black Emperor sect. However, the time wasn't right yet. If the Black Emperor sect stayed in Bazhou and was unwilling to leave, then the final outcome would be either being destroyed or annexed by the Sword Sect. Therefore, even though He Sui seemed to have lost a lot by giving up on Bazhou, in fact, he had successfully protected the Black Emperor sect and prevented the Black Emperor sect from coming into direct contact with the Sword Sect. Xiaochen understood what He Sui was thinking. However, it was useless to talk about this now that the Black Emperor sect had withdrawn. Bazhou was in front of Xiaochen now. Bazhou. Since the Black Emperor sect had withdrawn, Xiaochen naturally wouldn't give up on this delicious cake. Xiaochen didn't hesitate and immediately expressed his intention to take over Bazhou. Zhangxing and the others did not object to Xiaochen's decision. After all, the Ba Prefecture was now an ownerless land. Moreover, it was right next to the Sword Prefecture. As such, how could the Sword's Gate let go of this opportunity that was right in front of their mouths? Moreover, with the current strength of the Sword Sect, it wasn't difficult for them to take over Bazhou. On the contrary, it could be said to be very simple. This was because within Bazhou, no one was a match for the Sword Sect. Everyone agreed to take over Bazhou. With a consensus, Xiaochen decided, Zhangxing, Zhou Song, Lin Qing, the three of you follow me to Bazhou. Xiaochen was prepared to personally head to Bazhou. Song Xing and the other two would accompany him, along with 3 End-Realm experts. Along with the other sword sect experts, this strength was enough to shock all the powers within Bajou. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Song Xing and the other two nodded their heads in agreement. After settling the matter, Xiao Chen didn't return to his residence. He brought Song Xing and the other two along with the sword sect experts and left the sword sect, rushing towards Bajou. Xiao Chen had come to 100 Sword City before. It was located at the border between Bajou and Swordzhou. In the past, 100 Sword City was bustling. However, during this period of time, 100 Sword City was in chaos. There was a constant stream of ordinary people from the Bashou who wanted to enter the 100 Sword City. However, they had no choice as the Bashou was simply too chaotic right now. It was very difficult for people like them who had no cultivation, or rather, low cultivation, to survive in the Bashou. The current Bajou was like a barbaric world. All laws, morals, and principles were like floating clouds. Everything depended on one's fists. As for them who lived at the bottom, they were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered in the current Bajou. They didn't have any ability to fight back at all. Therefore, many people began to flee towards Bajou. However, with so many people surging into 100 Sword City, it also put a lot of pressure on 100 Sword City. After all, it was impossible for a small city like 100 Sword City to accommodate so many people. Therefore, many people who had rushed over from Bajou were turned away outside 100 Sword City. These people couldn't enter the city, but they didn't dare to return to Bajou. Therefore, they could only settle down outside the city for the time being. Many people knew that the 100 Swords City was absolutely safe. After all, no matter how chaotic the Bashou was, there wasn't a single power in the Bashou that dared to provoke the Swords Gate. Therefore, the 100 Swords City was absolutely safe. The city was already packed with people. Outside the city, if one stood on the city wall and looked down, they would see a simple slum that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were hundreds of thousands of people living here. In order to stabilize the order of 100 Sword City, the Sword Sect had sent many disciples to 100 Sword City. At this moment, in the city, on the city wall and outside the city gate, youths wearing the Sword Sect's disciple uniform could be seen everywhere. There were also deacons and even elders. However, what made everyone feel strange was that the elders and disciples of the Sword Sect in 100 Sword City were all gathered outside the city gate. It seemed like they were waiting for a certain important person. A person who could make the Sword Sect wait so respectfully was obviously not an ordinary person. Soon, everyone knew who the Sword Sect was waiting for. It was Xiao Chen and his group. Under the protection of Song Xing and the other two, Xiao Chen's figure appeared outside 100 Sword City. When they saw Xiao Chen, the Sword Sect's disciples respectfully greeted him. "Greetings, Sect Master." Facing their hearts, Xiao Chen nodded slightly. Then, surrounded by the crowd, he strode into 100 Sword City. The city lord's mansion had long been requisitioned by the Sword Sect. Now, 100 Sword City could be said to be under the direct jurisdiction of the Sword Sect. In the main hall of the city lord's mansion, Xiao Chen sat on the main seat. He looked at an elder below him and asked, "What's the situation now?" This elder had been in charge of the affairs of 100 Sword City. He clearly understood the current situation of 100 Sword City the most. At this moment, when faced with Xiao Chen's question, the elder replied nervously. "Sect Master, more and more refugees are pouring into 100 Sword City. The number of refugees is estimated to have exceeded 1,000,000. 100 Sword City is unable to cope with such a number of people, so the city has been temporarily sealed." This person was only an ordinary elder of the Sword Sect. It was impossible for him to come into contact with Xiao Chen. At this moment, in front of him, Xiao Chen, Song Xing and the others were all the higher-ups of the Sword Sect. Facing them, the elder couldn't help but feel nervous. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2042. Too many refugees had flooded into Hundred Swords City. This was the most difficult problem for Hundred Swords City to solve. Xiaochen was silent for a moment before he said, "They're obviously living outside the city. At the very least, Hundred Swords City is safe here. There shouldn't be any faction within the Bajou that dares to cause trouble here." Too many refugees had flooded into Hundred Swords City. This was the most difficult problem for Hundred Swords City to solve. Xiaochen was silent for a moment before he said, "They're obviously living outside the city. At the very least, Hundred Swords City is safe here. There shouldn't be any faction within the Bajou that dares to cause trouble here." With so many refugees, it was obviously impossible to let all of them into the city. Hundred Swords City simply couldn't accommodate so many people. Secondly, it wasn't the right time to let these people into the Sword Prefecture. After all, with so many people entering the Sword Prefecture, they had to find a place to settle down. Otherwise, how would they survive? For the time being, they could only live outside Hundred Swords City. As for food, the Sword Sect could provide it for the time being. After all, the ordinary people were different from the martial artists. They did not have the ability to fast, they had to eat to survive. However, if it was just ordinary food, it was nothing to the Sword's Gate. Not to mention millions of people, even if there were tens of millions of people, the Sword's Gate could still afford it. After instructing the elder to provide the refugees with food on time, Xiaochen turned to Zhangxing and the other two and said, "Let's go and take a look outside the city." As he spoke, Xiaochen's group began to walk out of the city. Due to the Sword Sect's disciples maintaining the city, the situation in Hundred Swords City wasn't affected too much. It was still the same as usual. However, just outside the city, it was like a completely different world. Chaos, clamor, crowded. This was Xiaochen's first impression of the outside of the city. As far as the eye could see, there were figures everywhere. It was indeed the first time that Xiaochen had seen such a dense crowd. Logically speaking, the area outside the city was very large. There was no need for them to be so crowded. However, everyone wanted to be closer to the city walls because only then would they feel safe. Therefore, everyone began to set up simple tents as close to the city walls as possible. Looking at these ordinary people without any cultivation, some of them were emaciated while others had lifeless expressions. Clearly, the chaos within the Bajou had exhausted these ordinary people. Compared to cultivators, the lifespan of ordinary people was as short as a meteor. An ordinary person's lifespan was as short as a lifetime. As for cultivators, an ordinary person's lifespan. They couldn't cultivate, and they didn't have any ambition to fight for supremacy. They just wanted to guard their own little piece of land and live a peaceful life. They wanted to be able to eat their fill and wear warm clothes. That was enough. As they strolled through the crowd outside the city, they noticed that Xiaochen and his group were dressed in luxurious clothing. Countless refugees around them also looked at them curiously. After all, Xiaochen and his group could not be refugees if they could wear such luxurious clothing. However, just as Xiaochen's group was slowly walking forward, a commotion suddenly broke out in front of them. They could faintly hear a woman's cries. Following the sound, Su Chonglu soon saw a young girl tightly hugging a bundle in her hands. In front of her, several young men were gathered. Some of them were even fighting for the bundle with all their might. "You're a woman. What use do you have for these treasures? Get lost." At the same time, the young man sneered and scolded her. Faced with the young man's forceful robbery, the woman desperately hugged the bundle in her arms. The wealth inside was her life savings. It was what she and her child would rely on in the future. In any place, only the fittest survived. It was the same for ordinary people. Seeing this scene, Xiaochen's expression didn't change much. To a cultivator at Xiaochen's level, the world of ordinary people didn't have any concern. However, since he encountered it today, and it was outside Hundred Swords City, he naturally couldn't pretend that he didn't see it. "Stop!" Su Chonglu shouted. Immediately, a very weak aura spread out from his body. He only revealed less than 1/10,000th of his power, but even so, the young men were instantly suppressed to the ground by Xiao Chen's aura. They lay on the ground, unable to move. The powerful pressure made them feel like they were about to be squashed into meat patties. Su Chonglu completely ignored these young men. A moment later, he withdrew his aura and said indifferently, "Get lost." Knowing that Xiao Chen was a cultivator, these young men didn't dare to offend him. They immediately got up and fled in panic. As they fled, the woman knelt in front of Su Chonglu and thanked him repeatedly. "Thank you, Lord Cultivator. Thank you." In the eyes of ordinary people, cultivators were almost like gods. Seeing this, Su Chonglu personally helped the woman up and smiled. "It's okay. It's just a small matter. There's no need for this." He originally wanted to comfort the woman, but at this time, the woman knelt in front of Xiao Chen again. No matter what he said, she refused to get up. At the same time, she begged. "Lord Cultivator, I beg you. I beg you to accept my son. Even if he's a servant, it's good." As she spoke, the woman beckoned her son. He was only 7 or 8 years old. She made her son kneel in front of Xiao Chen. The mother and son kept pleading. The woman guessed that Xiao Chen was a cultivator. Although she didn't know what Xiao Chen's cultivation was, as long as he was a cultivator, it was enough for her to look up to him. As a mother, the woman naturally didn't want her son to be like her. She didn't want him to be an ordinary person who was trampled under others' feet for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, the woman had never had the chance to come into contact with a cultivator. She had never even come into contact with low-level cultivators who were only in the celestial realm. Now that she met Xiao Chen, the woman cleverly seized this opportunity. She hoped that Xiao Chen would accept her son, even if it was just to be a servant. In the woman's eyes, even if it was just a servant, it was still a servant of a Lord Cultivator. It was completely different from ordinary people like them. Facing the mother and son's pleading, Xiao Chen's eyes flashed with a complicated look. For some reason, when Xiao Chen looked at the mother and son, he suddenly thought of the evaluation of the human race by other races in the Eight Desolates world. They were born weak, but they also had the ability to defy the heavens. The weak were like ants, while the strong could fight against the heavens and the earth. This was the truest evaluation of the human race. But now, Xiao Chen wanted to add another word, and that was tenacity. That's right, tenacity. Whether it was a cultivator or an ordinary person, the human race had a tenacious and indomitable spirit. Just like the mother and son in front of him. Although they were ordinary people, they could still do their best in order to survive. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2043. Xiao Chen was deeply moved as he looked at the mother and son kneeling in front of him. In the past, Xiao Chen didn't believe in fate at all. However, who could say that fate didn't exist in this world? Someone once said that the trajectory of a person's life was already predetermined when they were born. It was like the same person being born into a different family. Their subsequent experiences would definitely be completely different. Some people were born into royal families and possessed supreme power from the moment they were born. However, some people were born as ordinary people. They might not be able to reach the starting point of others even if they spent their entire lives. Was this fate? Perhaps, but Xiao Chen was more willing to believe that man could conquer nature. Xiao Chen looked calmly at the mother and son and said softly, "He doesn't have the qualifications to become my servant. However, as long as he lives, there will be hope. He can pursue what he wants." As he spoke, Xiao Chen took out a bottle of pills from his storage ring and handed it to the little boy. This bottle of pills was like trash to Xiao Chen. However, it was a priceless treasure to the little boy. It was the key to opening a brand new life for him. Xiao Chen didn't accept the little boy because he didn't have the qualifications. Xiao Chen wasn't exaggerating. As the sect master of the sword sect, who was at the peak of his power, Xiaochen believed that even an ordinary servant wouldn't be too bad if he accepted him. However, the little boy's ordinary talent was indeed not enough to be by Xiaochen's side. However, after experiencing the mother and son incident, Xiaochen had some new ideas in his heart. Or rather, it was a new ambition. After strolling around the outside of the city, Xiaochen returned to the city accompanied by Tsang Xing and the other two. The current 100 Swords city was under the control of many disciples of the sword sect. However, due to the continuous influx of refugees, 100 Swords city was indeed much more chaotic than usual. However, as long as the sword sect took complete control of Bazhou, these matters would be resolved very quickly. After returning to the city lord's mansion, Xiaochen said to Tsang Xing, "Spread the word that the sword sect wants Bazhou. Also, let your subordinates enter Bazhou and stabilize the situation there as soon as possible." Xiaochen naturally wouldn't give up on Bazhou. This was a piece of fat meat placed in front of his mouth. It would be a waste not to eat it. Furthermore, with the sword sect's strength, it wouldn't be too difficult to control Bazhou. Tsang Xing nodded when he heard Xiaochen's words. He then went to make the necessary arrangements. Xiaochen believed that Tsang Xing would handle the Bazhou. However, at this moment, Xiao was thinking of another matter. Zhou Song saw that Xiaochen was silent all the way to the back garden and asked, "Junior brother, what are you thinking about?" "Second senior brother, if everyone can cultivate, do you think such a thing can be achieved?" Faced with Zhou Song's question, Xiaochen didn't answer and instead asked the question of his own. Xiaochen was indeed thinking about this matter. He had just walked around the outskirts of the city and watched the ordinary people doing their best to survive. Xiaochen suddenly had this thought in his mind. This world was indeed the world of martial artists. Martial artists could do whatever they wanted, they could fight against the heavens and the earth. But for ordinary people, it was difficult for them to even do so. Perhaps in the next moment, disaster would fall from the heavens, or perhaps in the next moment, their lives would end. Faced with these powerless ordinary people, Xiaochen felt a little pity. Then he thought about the other races, like the god race and the beast race. Almost all of them were born with the power of the bloodline and could cultivate. No matter how high or low their cultivation was, almost all of them had a cultivation base. In this way, even if there was no need to talk about ambition, at least their lives were guaranteed. They were not like ordinary humans who could only resign themselves to fate. In the face of disasters that fell from the sky, they had no power to resist at all. They could only let it happen. As such, Xiaochen came up with the idea of changing the current situation so that everyone in the human race could have the opportunity to cultivate. He didn't want everyone to become a powerhouse, but at least they could have a little bit of cultivation so that they could be free from the torment of illness and live longer. To put it bluntly, he wanted them to have more strength so that they could harvest more food when they plowed the fields. However, when they heard Xiaochen's words, Zhou Song and Wu Huan were stunned. The two of them looked at each other, and then Zhou Song spoke up. "Let everyone have the opportunity to cultivate? Junior brother, your idea is a little whimsical. In the great wide world, there are countless ordinary people who don't have a cultivation base. If you want them to embark on the path of cultivation, you can almost say that you're going against the heavens." Zhou Song had never heard anyone say such a thing. After all, if he wanted so many ordinary people to have the opportunity to cultivate, the cultivation resources needed would probably be an astronomical figure. With so many cultivation resources, not to mention the sword sect, even the 10 great Ling Tian sects probably wouldn't be able to afford it. Moreover, which sect would use these precious cultivation resources on ordinary people who didn't have any cultivation base at all? Seeing that Zhou Song didn't believe his thoughts at all, Xiaochen smiled faintly, and a determined light flashed in his eyes as he thought to himself. Maybe it's going against the heavens, but I always believe that man can conquer the heavens. As long as one has the heart, there's nothing in this world that can't be done. Xiaochen secretly swore in his heart that one day, he would definitely change the fate of the ordinary people in the great wide world and even the entire world. he would let the ordinary people at the bottom of the hierarchy have the opportunity to cultivate. He didn't ask for their cultivation base to be high, just that they could have a certain level of cultivation. That would be enough. Of course, the current Xiaochen definitely couldn't do this, and Xiaochen knew that. However, even if he couldn't do it now, it didn't mean that he couldn't do it in the future. One day, Xiaochen would definitely be able to do it, and this also became Xiaochen's new goal. In Xiaochen's opinion, since he was born as a human and had the ability, he naturally had to do something for the human race. A brand new and unbelievable vision of greatness was slowly taking shape in Xiaochen's mind. A seed was planted in the bottom of his heart, and as time passed, this seed gradually began to take root and sprout. While Xiaochen was burying this thought deep in his heart, the next morning, the Sword Sect announced to the public that they would completely take over Basho. Anyone or any force that dared to covet Basho would become the enemy of the Sword Sect. Following this announcement, batches of Sword Sect disciples began to enter Basho from 100 Sword City in order to stabilize the chaotic situation in Basho as soon as possible. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2044. The surrounding powers didn't find it strange that the Sword Sect was eyeing Basho. After all, the Black Emperor sect had left and Basho was no longer an ownerless land. With the Sword Sect's current power, how could they give up on such a fat piece of meat that was already in their mouths? The surrounding powers didn't find it strange that the Sword Sect was eyeing Basho. After all, the Black Emperor sect had left and Basho was no longer an ownerless land. With the Sword Sect's current power, how could they give up on such a fat piece of meat that was already in their mouths? So the Sword Sect attacking Basho was something that many powers had already expected. With that, along with the Sword Sect statement, no one dared to go against the Sword Sect. What a joke, the Sword Sect couldn't even do anything to the Hetian sect. The Hetian sect was one of the top 10 Lingtian sects. Even the top 10 Lingtian sects couldn't take down the Sword Sect, so how could the other powers offend the Sword Sect at this time? Without any external powers fighting, the Sword Sect's control of Basho was naturally much smoother. The local powers within Basho weren't a match for the Sword Sect at all. Batches of Sword Sect disciples set off from 100 Sword City and entered Basho. They split into different groups and started to rush towards various parts of Basho. And this was only the first batch of disciples. There would be more Swords Gate disciples and Qi practitioners entering the Basho in the future. One could clearly see that when these disciples entered Basho, they all held their heads high and were filled with arrogance. Now that Swords Gate was getting stronger and stronger, the disciples of Swords Gate were naturally proud of it. After all, the strength of the sect was something to be proud of for the disciples of the sect. Each group of Sword Sect disciples was led by at least one Dao Realm elder. Sangxing was in charge of everything within Basho. Sangxing, an End Realm expert, oversaw the entire situation while the many Sword Sect disciples headed towards the various cities within Basho to stabilize the situation. On this day, Sangxing and several Sword Sect elders arrived at the largest city within Basho, Basho City. The Tyrant Emperor City was the largest city in the Tyrant Continent and was also the center of the chaos. One had to know that the Tyrant Emperor City was located right in the center of the Tyrant Continent and the three strongest local powers of the Tyrant Continent were gathered there. Following the departure of the Black Emperor sect, these three strongest powers within Basho were undoubtedly the ones with the highest hopes of ascending to the top and becoming the new ruler of Basho. Therefore, Sangxing's first goal was to stabilize the situation within Basho City. As long as Basho City was stabilized, the following matters would be simple. Standing in the air, Sangxing looked at the distant Tyrant Emperor City that was crawling on the ground like a huge beast. Sangxing's expression was natural, while an elder behind him flattered. It's just a mere Tyrant Emperor City. There's no need for the Vice Sect Master to personally come. We can take it down. Sangxing was one of the 8 deputy sect masters of the Sword Sect. Although his status seemed limitless, he was still the deputy sect master of the Sword Sect. However, as the sword sect grew stronger, the power in Song Xing's hands was also much greater than before. The elder who spoke just now also joined the sword sect later on. Naturally, he didn't dare to offend a deputy sect master like Song Xing. In the face of this elder's flattery, Song Xing didn't get carried away. His expression remained calm as he replied softly. I don't need to say more about the importance of Bazhou City. All of you should know that there is no room for mistakes. Alright, let's cut the crap and enter the city. After speaking, Song Xing took the lead and walked towards Bazhou City. With a single step, his figure appeared outside Bazhou City. Looking at the majestic city gates, Song Xing praised softly. This is indeed a majestic city. As he spoke, Song Xing's body emitted a soaring aura. Song Xing's actions were obviously to inform the three major powers of his arrival. Song Xing personally came here to take down Bazhou City. Sensing the terrifying end realm aura of Song Xing, very quickly, more than 10 figures rose into the air and arrived in front of Song Xing. These people were the three major powers of Bazhou City, the Chen family, the Wang family, and the Filiu sect. At the front were three middle-aged men. These three were the Chen family head, Wang family head, and Filiu sect head. The three of them were at the great circle of the Dao realm and were just a step away from breaking through to the end realm. Once they did, the three families would become a first-rate power. However, at this moment, the three people who could call the wind and summon the rain in Bazhou City were incomparably respectful in front of Song Xing. They were afraid that they would do something wrong and angered Song Xing. They all bowed towards Song Xing. Then, the Chen family head spoke first. We welcome Deputy Sect Head Song Xing. The three families knew that this time, Song Xing was in charge of Bazhou. Therefore, without even asking, the three of them knew who he was. Although the three of them had been the overlords of Bazhou City for many years, in front of Song Xing, the three of them didn't dare to be impudent. Not to mention that the three of them hadn't broken through to the end realm. Even if they did, they wouldn't dare to resist. This was because they knew that Song Xing wasn't the only deputy sect head in the sword sect. There were a total of 8 deputy sect heads. Moreover, these 8 deputy sect heads of the sword sect were all old end realm experts. Their cultivations were all above the end realm, and even the weakest one was at the end realm. They weren't people who had just broken through to the end realm could compare to. If the sword sect wanted to control Bazhou, the three of them naturally wouldn't dare to oppose. Although before the sword sect interfered, the three of them had used this chance to steal many cultivation resources and also wiped out many families and sects that weren't that strong. However, that was in the past. Now that the sword sect had interfered in Bazhou matters, the three of them could only stand to the side and hand Bazhou over to the sword sect. Perhaps he was a little unwilling in his heart, but what could he do? In front of the sword sect's suppressive power, the Chen family, Wang family, and Filiu sect couldn't do anything at all. Or rather, they didn't have any ability to fight back. Facing the Chen family head's words, Song Xing's gaze swept across the three families. Facing Song Xing's gaze, the experts of the three families all felt a huge pressure rise up uncontrollably from the bottom of their hearts. After all, the three of them had done many things before, and no one knew what the sword sect's attitude towards them was. Song Xing didn't say anything, and the atmosphere became a little tense. Luckily, not long later, Song Xing opened his mouth and said calmly, "Let's go, follow me into the city." Deputy Sect Head. Hearing this, the head of the Wang clan respectfully gestured for Song Xing to enter. Then, under the escort of a group of people, Song Xing strode into the city. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. You're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.